It began not with rockets, but with radio silence, then a beep,
A signal from the dark.
in the stillness of a sleeping world. The first artificial satellite, Sputnik, drifted above us.
And nothing would ever be the same.
The space race wasn't just a battle of science. It was a slow, secret duel of ideas, of dreams cast into the stars. Tonight, let's leave the shouting Cold War headlines behind and instead float gently through the hushed corridors of mission control. The quiet panic of failed launches and the soft rustle of blueprints sketched under lamplight. If the sound of slow spinning satellites, sleeping astronauts and whispering galaxies helps you unwind, then subscribe, hit the like button, and tap the bell icon so you never miss a calm stroll through cosmic history. From Sputnik to Apollo, from moon dust to midnight calculations, this is the space race as a lullaby. You begin in a room that does not look like the future. The paint on the walls is dull, the desks are wooden, and the telephones have cords that coil like sleeping snakes. It is late in the 1940s or early in the 1950s in one of several places that matter more than they appear to. A drafting office at Redstone Arsenal in Alabama, a lab at the NACA Langley Memorial Aeronautical Laboratory in Virginia, a cluttered corner of a design bureau in Moscow, or a prefabricated building near Kapustin Yar, where wind grinds through seams in the walls. The men and women inside are not dressed for the moon. They wear ties and cardigans, smocks and wool coats, practical shoes despite slick floors. On their pages are not rockets as you imagine them, but tables of dimensions, thicknesses, flow rates, stresses. You trace the lines with your eyes and find that the future, when it finally arrives, will come from these patient columns and numbers, dull, repetitive, and decisive. The space race starts for you in the unspectacular sorting of crates. In the spring and summer of 1945, after Germany's surrender, trucks grind across roads to ports and railheads, carrying the bones of a ruined program. V-2 rockets in pieces, turbo pumps, engines, guidance, gyros packed in straw.
Ring cases dented from hurried handling.
American officers mark and remark inventory listings for Operation Paperclip. Soviet teams do the same under different names, both sides rushing, neither side certain what is missing, until a crate is opened and someone sighs with relief or frustration. This is not yet a race so much as a salvage effort. In the desert of New Mexico, under a bruising sun, American crews reassemble V-2s and learn the smell of liquid oxygen in the morning. In the dry steppe east of Stalingrad, in places that will soon be familiar only to specialists, Kapustin Yar, later the unnamed Tyuratum, Soviet mechanics coax stolen technology into the shape of a copy, then the beginning of a departure. If you look closely at the banal work lists, you see how thin the line is between survival and failure. At White Sands Proving Ground, technicians run a piece of piano wire through clogged injector plates and wipe their hands, leaving grey smears on shop towels. They check vacuum tubes glowing faintly in racks, test a relay by tapping it with a screwdriver handle, and clip a paper tag to a valve stem that says "Ready." In the Soviet sites, fitters use cold hammers in winter to seat pins and curse the livid bruises on their fingers, then warm their hands over a pale heater. For both, the procedures become liturgy, checklists copied, revised, copied again, and filed in binders that will smell faintly of oil for decades. There are no speeches in these moments, only the precise fulfillment of steps that become, by aggregation, a new human capability. In the United States, the Army Ballistic Missile Agency coalesces under a name you will hear repeated often: Von Braun. Yet even around his name, you find committees and intermediaries and the slow drip of funding. The Army owns Redstone Arsenal. The Navy has its own rocket line with Viking and later Vanguard. The Air Force pursues long-range missiles with a colder eye. Inter-service rivalry is not glamorous, but it is potent. reports explaining why a particular booster belongs under one command rather than another, letters crossing desks between the Pentagon and Huntsville, and a quiet directive from the White House that a scientific satellite, if it is to be attempted, should not smell of uniforms. This leads, in the end, to something very ordinary, the creation of a program that spends most of its time ordering parts, hiring engineers, and building a tracking network. The word civilian appears in memos because it matters mainly to how the public will feel about the first metal object to circle the Earth. Walk with your attention into the laboratories of the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, the NACA, which is not yet the NASA, you know. Wind tunnels roar at Langley and Ames, but inside offices, engineers type considerations for stability and control that will later inform entirely different machines. The tone is methodical. Reports are notes on the effects of or considerations regarding the use of. There is a modesty to the language that conceals ambition. Meanwhile, in the Navy's Bureau of Ordnance and at the Naval Research Laboratory, radio men work on a chain of mini-track stations, their antenna arrays designed to catch the whisper of a satellite signal.
Nothing is in orbit.
This is planning for a possibility the world might dismiss until it hears it. The radios must be tuned, power supplies stabilized, grounding schemes tested, so that lightning will not melt the budget in an afternoon thunderstorm. There is a list titled Spare Parts, and it is long. In the Soviet Union, the structure of work is similar and more secret. The Design Bureau, OKB-1, headed by a man whose name is carefully guarded, he is simply the chief designer, draws the lineage from wartime scavenging to a peculiar new creation. The R1 is a V2 in Russian clothes, the R2 a stretched cousin, the R5 a signal of independent thought. Even small decisions matter. If you spend a minute with a manufacturing engineer, you find him talking about welding techniques for aluminum tanks or the handling of liquid oxygen in a place where winter freezes pipes and summer dust clogs filters. It is not an easy environment for cryogenics, and that difficulty seeps into every plan. Ground support equipment must be insulated, trucks modified, hoses checked for brittle cracking. The result is a culture of procedural stubbornness. Soviet technicians will become famous for improvisation, but in the beginning they are learning the one-step forward method typical of aerospace work. Identify failure mode, write a corrected procedure, attach it to the binder, repeat. You will likely find the R7 surprising if you come to it fresh, because it is a machine born of demands that do not reference satellites at all. The payload it is designed to throw is heavy and classified. To meet that demand, Soviet engineers concoct a configuration with 4 boosters strapped to a central core, all taking off together, a cluster of ignitions that must be precisely synchronized. Look at the plans for the launch pad at Tyuratam, and you will see accommodation for this shape, a service gantry that opens like a flower, the tulip of steel arms, flame trenches into which exhaust will be poured, water deluge systems tested and retested to keep concrete from spalling under the blast. Rails must be laid with gentle curves to carry the assembled vehicle horizontally from assembly building to pad. The climate demands that those rails be kept clear of snow and sand alike. Nothing about this is dramatic unless you love the details. And precisely in those details lies the capability to lift anything at all. Back in the United States, the argument for who will launch a scientific satellite settles politely and slowly
On the Navy's vanguard because it will look civilian and peaceful.
This decision echoes through anodyne meetings where minutes note attendance and nothing else remarkable. A man from one office brings up programmatic risk. A woman from another raises procurement lead times for transistors, which are still occasionally unreliable at temperature. The design of the mini-track network becomes a geography lesson, down the East Coast from Maryland to Florida, then across to the Caribbean, onward to the Canal Zone, and out to the Pacific, where stations require fences, generators, and people willing to live on quiet assignments. All of this takes time. Surveyors with clipboards, electricians filling junction boxes with compound, motor pools scheduling deliveries so fuel arrives when needed. If you are looking for the heart of the space race, you can find it in a requisition order for spare vacuum tubes and a receipt signed by a station chief who will not see his family for 6 months. Inside laboratories that smell of phenolic resins and solder, American scientists frame modest aims that will turn out to be decisive. A small suite of instruments to measure cosmic rays, a temperature sensor, a transmitter with a simple oscillating tone. These are not grand. They are reliable. The engineering notes focus blandly on power budgets, antenna lengths, and duty cycles. Batteries are not romantic. They are selected and tested with patience because failure here means silence. If a transmitter draws too much current in the cold of shadow, it will die. If it overheats in sun, it will die. The solution is always a graph, a rate, a new resistor value. The public will later hear an iconic beep, but what makes that possible are days spent deciding how many turns of wire to wind on a tiny coil and whether the varnish on that coil will crack in vacuum. Across the world in Soviet shops, the same questions are answered in a different style. There is less interchange with suppliers, more insistence on what can be done in-house, more reliance on careful men with files and lathes. The culture of the design bureau keeps secrets even from its own staff, so technicians know their station, not the whole. A radio engineer may never meet the man who wrote the mathematics for the orbit, and yet their contributions must mate without complaint on the day of assembly. If you sat quietly at a bench, you would see a woman soldering a harness with deliberate slowness, aware that cold joints are the enemy, and a foreman writing a note in neat hand that this harness must be wrapped with an extra layer of linen tape. These tiny redundancies are the difference between a machine that functions and one that does not. Nobody will know her name later. You are asked to remember the tape. Policy, as always, moves like a glacier. The International Geophysical Year is scheduled from 1957 into 1958, an agreed calendar of observation that suits both scientific curiosity and diplomatic theater. The United States intends to fly a small satellite under this aegis, and in quiet halls, President Eisenhower prefers that this occur without military trappings so that overflight of other nations might someday be considered normal. If you glance at a map in a conference room, you will see lines sketched for orbital passes and notations about altitude and perigee. But the most important note is a sentence about precedent. The lawyers and diplomats do not appear on the stamps of commemorations, yet their idea, make the first satellite seem routine, will matter as much as any engineering choice. Meanwhile, on the Soviet side, the same calendar offers a deadline and a cover. The planners begin to see how a small, simple satellite, Prostashi, the simplest, might be done quickly to ring the world before any rival. You can eavesdrop on the ordinary setbacks. A delivery of liquid oxygen valves is delayed because a supplier's furnace cracked its refractory lining. A tracking station's generator fails acceptance because its frequency regulation wanders under load beyond tolerance. An army quartermaster grumbles about tires wearing out on the long roads to White Sands. In Tiratum, ground crews fight dust that sneaks past gaskets and gets into actuators. An engineer writes a memo with the most pedestrian of titles, On the Control of Contamination, and the memo circulates quietly, urging more cleaning, more covers, more time. This is the truth of any complex program. Thousands of small avoidable problems threaten to become one large unavoidable failure. The hours invested in routine cleanliness are as crucial as any insight about orbital mechanics. You can smile at the boredom in these labors, and you would be wrong to underestimate them. The technicians who will test the transmitters practice with recorders and paper chart machines that eat ink, drawing wavering lines. They rehearse identifying signals amid noise, read off frequencies, calculate Doppler shifts with slide rules, and file their results soberly. Across both countries, the presence of these men and women turns an abstract orbit into a measurable event. The gears of the global apparatus are meshed. There are timekeepers at observatories, teletype operators in communication hubs, drivers who will deliver crates to the right dock on the right day, even cooks who will keep stations fed through holidays so that no one leaves their post to find dinner. You imagine how this looks at night. A light in a window of a small building in the Azores, a radio room humming in Melbourne, a lonely antenna field in Mexico under stars that give nothing away about the decade that is arriving. When you consider the competition itself, it is not yet a blaze of banners. It is, in its first real stage, cautious scheduling. The Soviets, aware of the R-7's strength and fragility, plan a basic payload: metal sphere, radio transmitter, batteries. Its elegance is its simplicity. The Americans, committed to a lighter launcher, continue their methodical work. If you stood in those rooms the week before the first attempt, you would not sense history. You would see men with dark crescents of fatigue beneath their eyes and the stubborn normalcy of project management. Are we on schedule? Will we make our window? Who needs a spare? Who forgot to initial the change form? People say that dramatic moments announce themselves. They rarely do. They present as a list of tasks with checkboxes, and someone is always behind on the paperwork. You should pause with the R-7's ground crew in the final days of September 1957, their hands chapped and blackened, the cold starting to bite mornings at the step pad. There are inspections of weld seams with dye penetrant, a routine that stains hands and cloth, and checks of the kerosine's temperature. Valve technicians whisper about leak rates, measurable only by the slow movement of a needle across a dial. A radio team, anxious about interference, walks the pad with a portable receiver, sniffing for unwanted emissions, and marks a cable run for rerouting. These are men and women who have learned to distrust luck. They will bank on procedure and repetition, the boredom of doing the same checks 3 times to catch the one flaw that hides itself in a convenient shadow. When they go home, the grit in their teeth tastes the same as it did in August. They do not know yet that their work is about to be a sound that will be heard in schoolyards and kitchens on the other side of the world. On the American side, rooms are filled with diagrams for the mini-track network and punch cards sorted into trays with labels typed in blocky uppercase. A young engineer is taught how to interpret the peculiar signatures of a satellite's passage, how to turn a shift change into a quantitative continuity so that data streams are not lost because 2 people met late at a door. Van Allen, a professor with a serious face and a precise mind, oversees instruments that look unimpressive: small tubing, light housings, the austere magic of Geiger counters that will someday sketch belts of radiation that no one has seen before. Many others crowd in their roles anonymous to any memory, but necessary in a way that looks dull until you realize that an invisible line of cooperation runs from a laboratory bench in Iowa to a dish antenna on
Antigua. You keep listening to the careful calm.
On one desk, there is a sealed envelope with contingency instructions if the transmitter fails after deployment. In another building, a technician is resoldering a joint that was already acceptable but just barely. These micro decisions, to add 10 minutes for an extra layer of care, to swap a component that still meets spec but lacks the comforting margin, aggregate into the survival of a machine in an environment where there is no help. The world that will soon wake to the space age is not inevitable. It is the sum of thousands of minor refusals to take a risk when a method exists to shave it away. If you are looking for the heroism, it is here in the mundane, in carrying the heavier toolbox because it contains the thing you hope never to use. As the day comes close, you find yourself in a very ordinary hallway where a clock ticks too loudly. Meetings are scheduled, rescheduled, and finally cancelled because everyone knows what needs to happen. There is no music. The steps fall into rhythm on their own. Fuel the tanks, pressurize the lines, arm the transmitter, check the batteries one last time. An observer in a white lab coat writes down numbers in a logbook with a fountain pen, scratching the date, 4th of October 1957, and noticing the ink is a little watery today. Outside, the sky is the same flat blue it has been since the end of summer. The wind carries dust across a vast rectangle of poured concrete. Somewhere far away, a child is doing arithmetic homework. Somewhere closer, a soldier sips tea and thinks about his boots. If you are standing at the pad, you do not see history. You see chaos transformed into order. The clamps retract. The engines light in a choreography that has been drilled over years, so the vast thrust comes on smoothly, the way a careful driver accelerates a heavy truck. The noise rolls over the step like a physical thing. A machine climbs, shedding smoke, and the ground crew knows how long they must wait before they are allowed to breathe again. In quiet rooms elsewhere, radios hiss, and then a signal emerges like a thread from a knot. A tone, simple, periodic, insistent. Nobody cheers loudly. People check watches, log the receipt of the signal, and phone the next station down the chain to say, as they always say, "We have it." Now you are in a suburban backyard in the United States, or on a balcony in Warsaw, or under a street lamp in Delhi. Someone has told you that a star is moving that is not a star. You cannot hear the beep with your ears in the air, but you know it is there, and that knowledge makes the sky different than it was a week ago. You tilt your head back and look for a dot that glides. On the ground, radios whisper, and tape reels turn, and pencils scratch. The orbit is still approximate. Its consequences are still unclear. The work that made it possible is anything but. You, standing under the sky, are about to learn what it feels like when normal changes forever because of patient procedures, unremarkable welds, and 12,000 checklists. But when the first beeps fade on this opening night, what exactly will they awaken in the rooms where budgets are set, in the labs where engineers watch their needles, and in the ordinary lives where the sky has suddenly acquired a voice? You wake to a morning where the sky feels slightly heavier than before. The sound you cannot hear directly, the steady tick of a radio pulse, has nonetheless settled into the thoughts of people you will never meet. The beeping that was planned to be so plain turned out to be precisely right for cutting through static. Sputnik's signal was designed with modest power and a humble antenna, but its meaning outran its wattage. Now a small sphere circles on a path that is calculated with pencils and corrected with tables, and a planet's worth of reactions begin. You notice that the earliest reactions are procedural rather than poetic. Phone calls to tracking stations, meetings scheduled in buildings that smell of coffee and floor polish, notices sent to committees that had been forming for months. The space age does not begin with fire but with paperwork that suddenly acquires urgency. In the United States, what surprises you is how unsurprising the offices look where the response is organized. You walk past a glass door that says National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics and see not men in silver suits, but ordinary engineers in shirt sleeves with black ties. They move slide rules like they are turning keys. The Navy's mini-track stations, which had been slowly ordered, prefabricated and delivered to warm islands and far coasts, now come into sharp focus. Tower crews who thought they had a week to finish storm bracing learn that they have a day. A shipment of vacuum tubes that was going to be unpacked after lunch is opened in the morning. Tracking technicians rehearse quickly the use of attenuators and note the quirks of each local receiver, the way one unit's oscillator is slightly more temperamental after a power outage. Every spare cable and connector is suddenly taken seriously, each one a potential single point of failure in a chain stretched across half the world. Across the world, in the Soviet Union, the design bureau that placed the first satellite into orbit is already working through a different set of steps. You find a meeting in which the chief designer proposes something more ambitious than a metal sphere that beeps. There is a proposal for a second satellite carrying a living passenger, a dog. The argument for it is blunt: do it quickly while the world is still adjusting to the first. The engineering effort that follows is as much veterinary as it is mechanical. Life support means oxygen bottles, carbon dioxide scrubbers, and a thermostat that must survive both the cold of shadow and the heat of sun. A harness is devised to keep the animal still, a simple water dispenser designed with a wick and reservoir that will respond to tiny licks. The electrical power budget is sharpened like a pencil. It is all very practical, even though it turns a name, Leica, into something that will stick in people's throats for years. You notice in these rooms the omnipresence of timelines drawn in pencil on graph paper, the axes labeled not in days but in tasks. There is a board that lists procurement for batteries that can maintain charge for a particular duration under cycling temperatures. There is debate about thermal control in a coffin-sized capsule where insulation both protects and traps heat. Someone suggests vents. Someone else tallies the leak rates, the intrusion of dust, the failure modes of a valve that will not close. A test rig is built where a stand-in capsule is baked and frozen, its interior lined with thermocouples. Engineers hover over chart recorders that draw lines as the temperature climbs and falls, their eyes flicking from one pen to another to catch the moment when a small fan begins to lag. None of this is dramatic, but if you count, you find that the consequences of each small decision add up to a living thing lasting hours instead of minutes, or perhaps days instead of hours. At the same time, the American plan for a peaceful, civilian-led satellite program now collides with a tempo the planners did not anticipate. Vanguard, the choice meant to signal scientific intent, becomes the center of hope and skepticism at once. The components are carefully laid out on workbenches and in assembly bays. The rocket stages, lighter and more delicate than their army counterparts, are inspected with white gloves, literally, because skin oils invite corrosion in areas where small currents must pass without arc or fade. A cage of metal is tested to reduce static interference around transmitters that will whisper rather than shout. What looks to you like patience becomes, under pressure, fragility. There are procedures for fueling and defueling, for purging lines to prevent ice plugs, for measuring tank ullage volume to predict boil-off rates. The sum of these steps is a daybook thick with signatures. You watch as the public's attention turns to televised launches. It is one thing to hear that a rocket is scheduled. It is another to see the slender shape on a pad, white against a sky that is not always kind. The cameras wait on tripods and the countdown is recited as though it were a liturgy. Hold, resume, continue. On the day of an attempt, the technician seems smaller against the steel lattice. The moment of ignition is almost always the same, a bloom of flame, a thrust that must overcome inertia and friction and fear. When a vehicle stumbles or rises and settles back with a sickening angle or bursts into a brief, humiliating flower of fire, it is not a failure in the abstract. It is a list of causes, a turbo pump that cavitated, a control valve that stuck, a cable that had not been secured quite the way it looked on the drawing. These are the failures that teach loudly what 1,000 meetings whispered. In a different set of buildings, army facilities where the Juno wing, adapted from redstone, is being refined, engineers who have maintained a polite distance from the civilian program find themselves asked to speed their schedule. The smell of cutting oil is stronger here. The habit of treating rockets as weapons has left a mark in the culture of the shop floor. The adaptation process, though, is not warlike. It is procedure. Instrument packages are reconsidered for mass. The balance of the upper stages is trimmed so that spin stabilization is not a theoretical line in a report, but a measured number in a bay. The upper stages themselves, stagelets clustered in a way that will seem quaint later, are fussed over for wiring integrity. An older technician insists on lacing harnesses by hand rather than relying on pre-made covers. It takes longer. It fails less. Meanwhile, the creation of NASA out of NACE begins as something that would not excite a child. It is legislation that runs to many pages, the conversion of letterhead, the reassignment of people from one box on an organizational chart to another. If you sit in the hall outside a small conference room in Washington, you hear phrases like authority to contract, availability of appropriations, and transfer of functions. Yet inside those phrases is a change in how a country will think about the sky. Committees form with names that are remembered only by archivists, planning boards for human spaceflight, steering groups for spacecraft design standards. There are arguments over whether to adopt Army practices for launch operations or to write a new doctrine entirely. A man with a calm voice says that the only way to make spaceflight routine is to treat its chaos with boring paperwork. He is not wrong. On the Soviet side, you sit at a telemetry console with the small green glow of a cathode ray tube giving you the shape of a signal, like as heart rate is a line among lines. The controllers narrow their breathing when the capsule passes from day into night because the thermal balance changes there. Because anyone who has held hand to an unpainted metal surface in sun knows how quickly it can get too hot to touch. The choice to fly now before every solution is known is political and technical at once. You can write the numbers on a sheet: heat load, expected shedding, insulation performance. You can see how a fan might fail when the worst set of circumstances align. Beyond that, you can only choose to fly or not. They choose to fly. The dog is launched. People in white coats lean over small desks, and in many places people in ordinary coats look up, searching the night for a moving dot, and think about a small creature that cannot know what a sky is. Back in American rooms, a new satellite is readied that will carry a Geiger counter and the intention to measure the radiation environment beyond the atmosphere. The instrument itself is simple, mechanical clicks turned into an electrical signal that becomes a number, then becomes a curve. The support electronics are built around vacuum tubes that will later look like antiques. To you in the present, they are delicate and convincing. A technician taps a tube with a fingernail to see if its microphonics are within tolerable bounds. Another measures filament current draw while cool and while warm. These precautions become necessary because the satellite's transmitter must share power with the instrument and the housekeeping electronics. Efficiency is not a metaphor here. It is a count of electrons in a battery cell whose chemistry is selected because its voltage drop under load is predictable within a margin that a mission planner can accept. You attend to the mini-track network again because without it, these objects would be mysteries to within a continent. The stations are tuned and tested. Spare parts are inventoried with the zeal of a quartermaster in a war. A coil of coaxial cable is unspooled. Its center conductor is examined for kinks. The outer sheath is inspected for nicks. Fences are repaired so that animals will not chew cables. A new ground rod is driven into soil that is stubborn in drought and mud in rain. The small things are never small. When the first American satellite rides on a Juno booster, the tracking network will hear it. The sound is not beautiful. It is reassuring. Now, on an evening you carry in your memory more as a texture than a sequence, the television shows you another launch attempt. Vanguard will try again. You are returning from dinner perhaps, or from work, and the picture is grainy. You see the rocket stand, sleek and poised, and you don't need to be an engineer to know that many failure modes have been chased and trapped in the weeks since the last try. The countdown is confident. The ignition is immediate. The rise is visible. The sudden settling and the collapse are breathtaking in the worst sense. Fire licks and then blooms. The camera wobbles just a little as the operator stands at his post. In homes, people say nothing. In laboratories, people breathe out and look down at their shoes. In some places, people grin, and in others, they look into glasses of tea and pretend to listen to the voices on the radio.
Even with this, the work continues.
A failure's report is written with numbers and sentences that never use the word humiliated, even if everyone knows how it feels. When Explorer 1 finally flies, you are reminded that what seemed delicate was resilient in the right hands. The upper stages fire as intended. The small package on top begins to talk. The data stream is uneven, reflecting decisions made to fit within power limits and broadcast schedules. The numbers are scribbled by hand on pads and then typed into a clean table later. But it is the first writing of something remarkable, belts of radiation that encircle the Earth. No one really expected that shape and intensity. Even in the sober voice of a lead scientist explaining his findings, you can hear the sense of boundary break, not a triumphal shout, but a widening of a known map. In quiet corners of offices, people who work on shielding and on electronics reliability begin to scribble their own notes because the new environment will chew at their margins and insist on redesigns. This is not a headline. It is a procurement problem. It is also a step into an understanding that will change how human craft can survive outside air. At this point, you may think of grand strategies, but what you see are careful steps turned toward permanence. On both sides, the networks to hear these signals are improved. In the United States, construction permits are issued faster than they were last month. Satellite payload teams meet in rooms that had been reserved for other agencies. In the Soviet Union, separate teams that handled launchpad operations are merged or reconfigured because the tempo demands a different flow. Clerks file new forms for overtime and ration coupons because working at the pad is long and in places quite far from everything. A woman in a small office counts keys to tool cabinets and initials a log when an extra set is cut. An engineer in Huntsville orders a second run of a bracket because the tolerance on the first batch leaves less room than he likes for thermal expansion. These details are the cadence of speed under control. They are not graceful, but they are effective. The political consequences are structured as committees and hearings. You watch as a senator asks a question about science education as if he had been thinking about it for years, and maybe he had, but now there is a budget line attached to the thought. A bill is written that will fund laboratories in schools and scholarships for students who say they are interested in mathematics and engineering. In high schools are classes that will grow more rigorous in a few years, but first must grow more numerous. Companies that made test equipment for industry now sketch brochures that suggest the same tools are suitable for teaching. Someone signs purchase orders. A supply room receives a crate of oscilloscopes that glint in fluorescent light.
It feels less like a crusade than like a renovation.
The change is in how many places a student can find a knob and a dial under their fingers, in how a teacher can show and not just talk. If you ever wonder how big shifts happen, sometimes the answer is that 1,000 rooms become slightly different. Back at the pads, the teams learn that winter and summer bring their separate challenges. In hot months, a launch window can be tangible as heat shimmer, with fuel lines more prone to vapor lock and the smell of kerosene heavier. In cold, condensation and brittleness haunt the checklists and rubber behaves poorly, and people's hands lose some dexterity. Procedures adjust with seasons. A leader on a pad learns to watch for the moment when a team's mood dips from cautious discipline to anxious hurry. He will say something like, "We are not behind," even if the clock says otherwise, because he knows the cost of rushing. This is the part of the space age that never becomes august in museums, the human management of boredom and nerves at once. As 1958 turns and runs toward its midpoint, Sputnik's initial beeping has trailed off. Laika has disappeared into a paragraph where opinions about ethics and necessity cannot be reconciled with a number for hours aloft. Vanguard, injured and mocked, puts a small satellite into orbit at last, a modest success that comes not from revenge, but from a procedure that finally held at every stage. Explorer multiplies into Explorer 3 and 4 and more, small craft that act like diligent messengers. You keep seeing the hands that assemble, tighten, sign, pass. The Soviet program trims for weight and adds for capability, a constant tension between mass margins and ambition that exists beneath every headline. The American response, layered in military urgency and civilian planning, begins to take a shape that will stabilize into an organization designed to survive a decade of exacting work. You are not yet at the moment when people climb into capsules, but you can feel it coming in the ways that benches and beds are being designed, seating pads tested for acceleration loads, the angle of a couch that might reduce the strain on a human chest, a touchscreen nowhere in sight because everything is mechanical and analog habit. Medical teams draft protocols for monitoring heart rate and respiration under stress that is not familiar to hospital wards. Parachute packers, who know a different part of the sky from wartime, begin to teach their methods to groups who will later stitch their expertise into capsules that must not land like stones. It all seems preliminary, and it is, but it is also inevitable. The lines from these details aim not merely at orbit, but at the kind of orbit that will carry a heartbeat and a
Voice that answers back when a call sign is
said into a microphone. What is left hanging in the air, like a note sustained too long, is not whether this will continue. You have no reason to doubt that, but what the true price will be, in money that can be tallied and in something else that cannot, when the next step is to replace beeps with a human voice saying, as plainly as possible, that it is still there. You begin this section not at a launch pad, but at a hearing room. The ceiling is decorated with plasterwork that speaks to an older dignity. A row of microphones waits for statements that have been rehearsed and facts that have been checked. And yet the air holds a quiet strain because this is the place where urgency is converted into law. The conversation is about organization, about creating a central authority for space activity that is not scattered among services and committees. The names of agencies shift like chess pieces. NACA will become a space administration. Defense research will be organized under a new umbrella in a different building. Budgets will be moved, not in leaps, but in careful steps. The new administrator wears a suit that could be mistaken for anyone else's, but his schedule is different. He will need to find a way to receive reports that do not hide risk under the language of acceptable variance. In Huntsville, you sit at a table where pencils are worn down to nubs because the habit here is to make corrections in graphite, not ink. A team has been assigned to consider the question of reliability, not as a single number, but as a chain of probabilities where each link represents a component that could fail. They draw block diagrams with boxes for systems and lines for dependencies. It is not immediately exciting, but it is how they will prepare to put a human into a machine and expect to see that human again on the ground. The Army heritage shows in some assumptions redundancy is a virtue weighed against mass. Test, when possible, as close to the real environment as you can. There is a recurring phrase in these discussions, test like you fly. It means nothing beautiful. It comes down to conducting enough rehearsals that surprises become rare. On the Soviet side, the Design Bureau is a community of secrecy and craft. You find metal being shaped on lathes that have been in the shop for years. A machinist runs a finger along a freshly cut edge and nods. A younger worker brings a part for inspection and waits, patient and stiff, for a verdict that will come wordlessly, a slight dip of a chin that says, acceptable. There is a discipline here that is not military and not exactly academic. It is the discipline of people who know that an error at a bench becomes a failure on a pad where there is no shelter from consequences. The chief designer moves between rooms with a light step, speaks softly, and sets direction with a hand on a drawing. You might think of charisma. He thinks of schedule and mass and fuel. Loyalty is kept by an understanding that the work will matter, and that the man at the center will take the brunt of mistakes upon himself so long as the work continues. You learn about a different kind of tool, the checklist. It appears in both programs like a spine, drafted, revised, tested, and laminated. It seems simple until you have to use one while sweat runs into your eyes and a valve refuses to show pressure that should be there. The checklist cuts through panic by saying that panic is forbidden.
a step must be read out, done and confirmed.
If a step cannot be done, there is a branch to follow. If a step is done incorrectly, the consequences are enumerated and steps exist to mitigate them. It is a way to bottle experience for a moment when thinking is too slow. A ground crew chief who resists the temptation. To rely on memory is a person who grants a mission the chance to survive a day when nothing is in the mood to cooperate while the first satellites continue to chirp their data or fail quietly when their batteries go flat. The next order of business arrives. The stations that listen must expand and their capabilities must deepen. The United States builds up a network of stations connected not by romance, but by cables and teletype. Traffic clerks, hardly ever praised, learn to route messages efficiently because the daily flow increases. A station in the Pacific needs a new generator, and the preferred model is back-ordered. Procurement finds a substitute and arranges for a spare set of brushes to arrive by a commercial flight. Radios do not care that the nearest town has a good diner. They care that the power is clean and stable. On an island where the station's fence is a simple wire with posts, a technician patches a gap with a length of rope rather than leave it to the goats. This is not what he thought he would be doing with his training, and he is doing it because signals die without the quiet, unbroken bubble that a well-run station provides. In the Soviet global apparatus, you watch a similar set of improvements, though the maps are less frequently shared. Ships at sea become listening posts fitted with dish antennas that swing slowly in search of the right geometry. Crews learn to damp their expectations. You can turn the dial through hiss forever. When the signal comes, it is unmistakable. A summer afternoon turns to evening on the deck, and someone calls down to the radio room that they have it. A man who has been up for 19 hours writes time of acquisition in a log with a stub of pencil he keeps because the eraser on his new pencil is too soft and smudges the paper. He will sleep when the shift changes. He will wake and fix a connector with a soldering iron for the third time because salt air sneaks into places where schematics never go. Behind the public's eye, the engineering begins to reshape itself with humans in mind. Capsules are drawn as spherical or bell-like because re-entry is unforgiving to shapes that assume too much stability. The mathematics of re-entry heat are worked on blackboards in rooms that smell like chalk. The numbers for stagnation points and boundary layers are not sexy. They drive choices about ablator materials that are chosen for how they char and not for how they look under a museum light. At the factories that will produce the heat shields, normal industrial concerns meet cosmic ones. Batch variability is suddenly not just a cost issue, but a risk to survival. Quality assurance inspectors are trained to notice bubbles that hide inside a casting and to reject a part that would probably work, because probably is now a slur. The physical training of future cosmonauts and astronauts is not as glamorous as you might expect if you stand in the corridors where schedules are posted. There is centrifuge time, which is mostly waiting in a suit for a spin that lasts less than a minute at peak load, recovering with water that tastes like the inside of a hose, and doing it again. There is time in altitude chambers where boredom becomes a test of discipline as much as the lack of oxygen is a test of physiology. There are medical examinations that record data more than they judge character. In hidden notes, doctors speculate about how long a human can endure weightlessness and in what ways that state will alter balance and fluids. The answers are mostly guesses now, informed by flight medicine that learned in other contexts. The trick will be to prepare enough without knowing everything. It is, you realize, the great ordinary challenge of any first step. A dark lesson arrives unannounced to those who will listen. On a distant pad hidden by secrecy and silence, a rocket meant to carry a different payload suffers a catastrophe so awful that the official narratives will not say its name for years. Fire is as old as human fear, and here it burns through men and machines with indifference. The documentation where it exists is dry, and yet you can read the stutter between the lines as procedures that should have been separated by cautious hours were compressed into
minutes by pressure and schedule and a culture where urgency could override prudence.
If you think this is comfortably far from the path to space for people, you are mistaken. Every tangle between schedule and safety is a question that will be asked again and again. Every answer written into a procedure isn't just a line of text. It is an attempt to prevent names from becoming footnotes. Back in America, a culture of testing that sometimes seems fussy asserts itself. Rocket stages are tied down and burned for longer than anyone thought politically wise before. Engineers endure the condescension of those who want results without smoke. The habit of taking engines apart after a test and measuring wear patterns develops into a religion. Micrometers are as sacred here as mission patches will someday be. At the same time, a decision emerges quietly through memos and meetings. There will be a separate project for human flight, a capsule that is small, a launch that can be aborted, a recovery at sea where the Navy can do things it understands. The name Mercury is chosen. It will grow heavy with meaning.
At the naming, it is just a selection from a list on a piece of paper.
The work it implies is 1,000 orders for parts and a dozen new procedures for ships that will find and lift a small bobbing cone from salt water gently enough that nothing inside is broken. On the Soviet side, the idea of Vostok takes shape in the way a rectangle slowly reveals a circle drawn within it. The control philosophy is different. There is more automation planned, a faith in machines that is partly cultural and partly strategic. A flyer's hand on a stick is not to be trusted beyond certain edges of the envelope. A compromise is designed where a manual override exists in a sealed envelope to be opened by the flyer if the machine refuses to listen. The decision seems pedantic until you imagine the moment when a person might have to decide whether to trust a procedure written months ago or to trust their own pulse rising. The public wants faces to attach to these plans, but the programs resist. Selection is clinical. In the United States, candidates move from station to station under the eyes of doctors and the calm instruction of test administrators. The tasks look absurd at times, swallowing sensors, carrying out math after hours of discomfort, but they are intended to weed out not only fragility but unpredictability. In the Soviet Union, selection is less reported and more constrained, but the core is similar. Find a body and a mind that will follow procedure and remain calm while pinned to a couch like a beetle to a card. The ordinary heroism here is not in daring but in compliance. It is an acceptance of tedium in service of a moment. In parallel, the people who build tracking stations and launch towers and ship's cranes are still doing the same tasks they did in the first days of beeps. They repair broken hinges. They tighten bolts that vibrated loose because steel has its own music under stress. They clean glass windows on consoles because fingerprints look like smears on a readout, and smears can become misreadings. A new generation of printers arrives at a tracking site and someone learns to change the ribbon without tearing it. In a machine room, climate control units are serviced so that the temperature does not drift into ranges where equipment fails in boring, expensive ways. The glamour people seek never visits these rooms, but it depends entirely on them. The preparatory years before humans fly are, you realize, an accretion of such details into a safety margin that cannot be guaranteed. That margin has to be borrowed from foresight rather than paid out of omniscience. Schedules tighten and widen like the breath of a tired runner. Teams learn whom they can trust to give bad news before it is too late. Histories tend to compress all this into a sentence or two. The agency was created, programs were initiated, and after some setbacks, a launch occurred. To live this time is to know that most days are grey, and most victories are scribbles on a whiteboard that will be erased to make room for the next estimation. You come to the threshold now because everything that was required to cross it has been gathered. The capsules have passed tests that destroyed their siblings. The rockets have shown enough reliability in static fires and in lifting satellite mass that an extrapolation can be made. The search and recovery forces have landed helicopters on decks in rough seas enough times that the choreography is muscle memory. Medical opinions still diverge like fanned cards, but their differences are measured against the reality that a schedule exists and that engineering can bracket the unknowns. The next narrative turns toward a man whose first name you know and whose last name is spoken lightly now in kitchens and in mess halls where few know what is about to become of him. The quiet question that ends this first story is simple. If you let it be, after all this painstaking preparation, what will it feel like in the rooms where checklists are read and in the chest of the person strapped in, to hear a countdown reach its end and understand, not in theory but in breath, that the age of beeps has ended and the age of voices has begun. You find yourself, as you often do in this history, in a room that does not look like a future. The ceiling is low, fluorescent lights hum. On the wall is a map of the planet with lines that curve in thin loops, predicting ground tracks like threads sewn across a green and blue cloth. The chairs are standard issue, but the people here are preparing to send another person into an environment no one has felt since the first moments of life, floating and pressed against by forces misdirected and strong. The voice that will be in the loop is chosen, trained, checked, and checked again. The ordinariness of the space conceals the reach of its task to make a human the payload and the instrument at once. Yuri Gagarin walks hallways that could be any base in any country. Linoleum floors, a smell of clean that always suggests something else underneath, perhaps oil, perhaps soap. He is compact, with a smile that looks practiced in friendliness and natural in reserve. His training is a stack of repetitions. He learns the systems of a capsule that is both more automated and more unforgiving than any cockpit he has known. He reads checklists in the same cadence that ground crews use, because the cadence is as important as the words when nerves make the mouth move too quickly. He adds nothing dramatic to these words. He inserts them into a discipline where trust is placed in sequences. Across the Atlantic, the Mercury 7 perform their own theatre of preparation. Their names will become famous in magazines with glossy pages and in newsreels that speak in an announcer's confident baritone. But in the training building, those names are labels on schedules. They share the centrifuge with nausea and the pool with a weight belt. They learn egress from a bobbing capsule, like children learning to get out of a bathtub without flooding the floor. They argue, lightly, about the role of the pilot in a capsule more like a bullet than an airplane.
And their arguments find their
way into memos through intermediaries who understand that egos can be managed if procedures are written with enough flexibility to offer an illusion control. Both programs meet the same wall. Weight, mass is the currency that buys margin. The American capsule is small enough that a person must fit it like a tailor-made suit. The Soviet capsule is larger in diameter but no more generous in its tolerances. Food is reduced to paste. Suits are tailored to remove seams that could rub into sores during hours of forced stillness. Instruments are stripped to essentials, with redundancy assigned like a miser doles out coins. Battery chemistry is reconsidered one more time. In a lab, a technician weighs a component on a small balance and writes numbers with a stub pencil because it was on the table and works. Another across an ocean does the same and hums the same tune without realizing it. Launch vehicles, trained by the last years to either behave or to reveal their faults on the ground, now carry a new item in their topmost weight and balance calculations, a heart. The booster that will carry a human is not new. It is the product of copying and improving. That was the style of the previous decade. The adjustments made for this purpose are dull to describe and crucial to perform. Add a system that can pull the capsule away in an emergency. Check the speed and reliability of the pyrotechnic bolts that must release at exact instants. Verify the control system's sensitivity so that oscillations cannot throw structural loads out of spec when mass shifts slightly under acceleration. The test stands have seen fire. The moment arrives to translate that experience into a
promise that everyone knows is only a promise because the sky can be
unkind to those who elevate hope over the tolerance on a weld. The key medical question remains open longer than outsiders understand. Does a human lose their sense of balance and function in a way that renders them useless after minutes? Or does the body adjust in a way gentle enough that work can be done? Physicians argue quietly through papers and meetings. A few say that the answer is one way, and a few that it is the other, and many say the margin is broad enough that function will remain. In the Soviet plan, the capsule will run itself mostly, not because the human is untrusted in principle, but because the human is an additional system with its own unknowns. In the American plan, the pilot is meant to be more than ballast. The divergence is partly philosophy, partly a reflection of the confidence that each organization has in its own control systems. You understand that this is not a disagreement as much as a partial overlap of beliefs under constraint. When Gagarin's day arrives, it is laid out like any day on a pad, which is to say, it is planned and then adjusted, as reality suggests. He is awakened, he eats. He is tested for readiness with a prosaicness that hides the tension of those who would keep him in the loop if they could. The bus ride to the pad is as ritualistic as it is practical. Steps are climbed. The suit is checked in ways that insult no one and trust nothing.
Straps are tightened.
The cockpit is both claustrophobic and reassuring because every control is where measurement said it should be and where fingers learn to go by touch and not by sight. A seal is confirmed, a hatch is closed, and in those last minutes, words spoken into microphones belong as much to the record as they do to the ears. The countdown can be boring. It is designed that way. The heartbeats inside capsule and control room disagree. Ignition for this flight is like ignition for every flight, except that now a human is in the chain, and a pause at a wrong instant could mean that the correctness of every plan dissolves into a fact. The rocket lifts. It shakes as it always does. The voice in the loop reports tones and sensations as if reading a weather report, which is the point. The call-outs inside the control rooms come as steps checked off that have been checked off before. Rise, stage, separation, more acceleration, the shift from heavy to light that is sudden and profound. The voice says it is feeling well. The orbit is attained. The math for the ellipse, the numbers for perigee and apogee, match what the tables predicted in the ideal scenario where nothing in the combustion chamber had an off day. Now the plan for a single orbit flows into time like a bead of mercury stretching under the glass. Inside the Vostok capsule, light wraps around like a toy reprising dawn. The Earth is around us, known and unknown. Gagarin is not a poet today because the script allows only small moments for awe. He notes what he is supposed to note, breathes, moves, tries small actions. The instruments are his world and not the world outside. The machine does most of the work and it does not resent being doubted. Manual override remains in the envelope, a sealed choice that is not needed. The re-entry mechanism is not glamorous. It is a retrofire, a particular impulse meant to slide the orbit down into air in the right place so that landing will occur where people can retrieve a man and not a memory. A slight mishap during separation causes the capsule and service module to flirt with entanglement, a reminder that every check is a promise and not a law. The atmosphere grows thick again. The fire outside is a physics demonstration on a scale that the body can feel in pressure and sound more than in heat. The landing is not a landing as you imagine it. The man leaves the capsule and arrives separately, a parachute report becoming a colored shape in the sky that leads ground teams to their finish. The return of a voice that said it would return is felt differently in different rooms. In Soviet offices, the joy is public, bounded by the words chosen for it. In American control rooms, there is a quiet acknowledgement that a lead has been established and that speed must be combined with care. The conversation turns toward the next Mercury attempt, suborbital first, because the rocket available will not yet carry the full ambition into orbit. The Redstone, thick and honest, will do a hop that will feel to the public like a smaller achievement and to the engineers like a necessary rung on the ladder. Alan Shepard will sit where many have sat during tests, but with a sky in front of him that only a very few have seen. He will ride a stack that has been made true through incremental improvements, lessons from tests where engines shut down prematurely and valves preferred to stick. He will land with a Navy recovery team whose practice has become the real event, where ropes and hooks and hands take over from mathematics and combustion. In the Mercury capsule's development, you see the feminine precision of seamstresses employed alongside machinists. The tiny wrinkles that form where fabric must conform to curves under pressure are smoothed by hands that have learned through years when to tug and when to press. The pressure suit is not a knight's armor. It is a garment that behaves when its wearer does not panic. The parachutes are packed like secrets, folded with ritual, sealed with check signatures, and stored with attention to humidity that would make a librarian nod. The quiet hero here is the packer who will only ever know whether she did her work right by watching a canopy bloom at the right height against a blue that makes the eyes water. There are no speeches for the packers, and they require none. The ritual itself is its own assurance. Recovery planning, so dull in outline, determines whether a success is acknowledged as such. In the ocean, currents do not care about schedules. Ships must be in particular boxes in gridded sea. Helicopters must be fueled, pilots rested, weather briefings delivered in time to change course. The call sign procedures that sound like radio crossword puzzles are meant to reduce confusion when the air is full of voices. The medical protocol after retrieval, so restrained as to be almost rude, is made to see whether the person they hauled aboard is not merely alive, but intact in ways that matter. You will see images later of the grin and the wave. The hours before those are the ones where strokes would be caught, where temperature dysregulation would be treated, where a mind reoriented to a gravity that feels heavier than the one that was left. Gagarin's orbit and the Mercury suborbital flights do not end anything. They open a path through a question which is, can operations become stable? The merciful boredom of repetition is coveted now. Reliability is a shape that must be learned by counting launches that go right more than by imagining them. The way to get there looks like the life you have observed throughout these stories. People showing up on time for jobs that are the same as yesterday's and tomorrow's, forms filled, parts ordered, faults logged, repairs verified by second signatures. You might think it's anticlimactic. It is not. It is where every hero you can name stands on the shoulders of a million small tasks that are not and cannot be named. The questions that remain, hanging like tools on a pegboard, are practical and profound. How do you dock two craft without fogging the line between caution and audacity? What happens to bones and hearts when the months stretch, not just hours? Can a culture of checklists and tests survive success as well as it survived fear? And for the next voice that will be heard through static, a voice saying that it can see the horizon curving away, what words will be both true to the moment and useful to the engineers listening with pencils poised? You are inside a room with no windows and too many clocks. The clocks are not synchronized to rule the day. They are set to stations that sit on islands and deserts and coasts, linked by cables that hum in walls and antennas that look like skeletal umbrellas waiting for rain that is made of radio waves. There is a line for Bermuda, a square for the Canary Islands, a dot labeled for a place that is more relay than destination. Muchia, Woomera, Kano, Zanzibar, Hawaii. The network is a chain around the planet, and the job here is to make sure no voice is lost as a capsule slides across the sky at a speed that makes geographic distances look like a matter of breathing in and out. You feel the hum of the air conditioning and the way people perform their tasks as if they can hear the world turning. The American plan to catch up begins with a concession to physics and to schedule. The Mercury capsule will fly suborbital first on top of a redstone adapted from the Army heritage of missiles that push and do not pretend to be elegant. Alan Shepard's flight is assembled out of precise pieces that have been tested in blocks. The capsule is pressurized and depressurized so many times that its hisses sound familiar, like a house settling at dusk. The suit is checked with gauges that nurses use for blood pressure and doctors for respiration. The old and the new pressed together like palms for a prayer that does not ask for miracles. The checklists multiply, not out of fear, but out of memory. Every problem that appears once gets a line. Every line gets a number. Every number becomes a way to speak calmly when the brain wants to. Sprint ahead of the mouth, you sit with the range safety officer who holds a plastic guard over a button that is designed to end a flight if a rocket wanders into trajectories that point toward populated places. The idea is as dull as it is moral. No experiment is allowed to endanger those who did not consent. The abort system is strapped to the nose of the capsule like a spear that points the wrong way. Its solid motors are not beautiful. They are trustworthy in the way of devices that ignite and do not ask for attention while they work. Shepard's view when it comes is through a small window set in a wall of instruments. The red stone burns, the separation occurs, the silence of free fall is not silence at all because pumps still hum and radios still whisper. The brief arc, with its apogee and its apportionment, of minutes between powered and unpowered flight is enough to test the habit of speaking in measured sentences while the view out the window plays tricks on the part of the mind that believes the horizon is always flat. The landing is a ballet you only appreciate after watching it in rehearsal. Navy ships are arranged on a grid that is drawn on paper map overlays, the helicopters fueled with a timing that allows for circling without anxiety. The capsule bobs and a dye marker blooms in a deliberate green, telling air crews, here, not there. Ropes are cast, hooks found their loops, and the hatch is opened with a tool that looks mundane because it is allowed to be so, only when the explosive path remains unused. Medical checks are less dramatic than they sound. A light in the eyes, a stethoscope's cold disc, words tested for slur by asking for serial numbers. A man steps onto a deck that stinks of fuel and sea and is handed a towel that is as ceremonial as any laurel wreath, because it means you are back and you are as intact as we planned. On another day, a second suborbital flight repeats the ritual and adds its own stubborn lesson. Gus Grissom's capsule lands correctly, and then a hatch explodes open with a violence that seems misdirected because the sea is calm and the plan did not call for this. Water climbs into a space that was designed to be its own world, and the capsule sinks. The engineers do not throw up their hands. They inventory. Was the detonation mechanical or human? Was a lanyard brushed or a switch believed safe set a millimeter too close to its edge? The next checklists change by lines, not by paragraphs. Tolerances for safety pins are measured. The hand movements required to remove them are rehearsed as if choreography can exercise accident. The public will argue about blame. The engineers will add a witness mark here, a guard there, and ask a simple question of themselves. How do we make it impossible to do the wrong thing by doing the right thing the wrong way? Beyond these hops, orbit lurks with its arithmetic requirements. The Atlas, a booster designed to carry more ominous cargo, must be made into a vehicle with a personality acceptable to those who must sit on top of it. Atlas is thin-walled, a pressure-stabilized tube that droops like a tired flower without internal support. It is strong when inflated, so launch preparations include the unromantic but vital task of making sure pressure is present whenever structure is demanded. Technicians verify helium bottles with a rhythm that comes from repetition. Pressure up, valve check, pressure maintain, leak test, record. They learn the sound of a good seal and the smell of a bad one like bakers learn yeast. Atlas engines require clean propellant lines. They shiver if struck by vibrations that stack into resonance. The pogo that engineers soothe by adding accumulators that act like shock absorbers for liquid. You watch men with slide rules find their way to a solution by drawing squiggles that represent damping and gain. The art inside engineering that a later generation will hide inside software. To qualify mercury for the heat of return, test articles are flung through air that thickens with speed, a trial that goes by the name Big Joe. The capsule is a blunt object because bluntness moves shock away from surfaces that would otherwise cook. The ablation material is meant to char and erode in a way that looks like failure and is success. Inspectors run fingers over pitted surfaces as if reading script feeling for textures that match predictions.
A scale stands ready to weigh what remains.
Every gram that is burned off leaves a memory in a table of numbers, and the table becomes a confidence that engineers translate into a sentence no one outside the room ever hears. It will work. You return to the room with clocks because orbit demands cooperation. The Goddard Center's consoles sit in rows that insist no one is above the process. Even the director must walk along the same tile floor that carries the cable tray's hum. Procedures are dry: uplink, downlink, patch through, call sign, confirm. The line from Bermuda to the next station must be clear. The tech who has to switch the circuit does so by moving a plug that is heavy in the hand and satisfying in the way of physical certainty. Somewhere, a man listens to a voice come in late by a fraction and adjusts a knob to bring it home. The continuity of these motions adds to a capsule's path the safety that cannot be found in any one place. If a decision must be made quickly, any loop member can speak, but speaking is not the same as deciding. The voice nets form a map of authority that looks diffuse until an emergency compresses it to a point. The Soviet program, having sent Gagarin like a message written in a single line, now writes a longer one. Kerman Titov's Vostok 2 stays up not for a quick demonstration, but for orbits that stretch into a day. Nausea intrudes, a reminder that a human is not a sensor that reads neatly. The reports are candid in their way, filtered through a system that transforms physiology into acceptable narrative. Heat control continues to be the dull and crucial matter. The cabin must be neither oven nor icebox. Batteries are asked to do their duty for longer than before, and they do, but only because line workers tested their discharge curves until they could recite them like a psalm. The landing is again separate, the man on a parachute drifting to the ground that is a specific place on a wide step. A capsule smashing into soil with a violence that tells the ground crew they removed their flyer from it just in time. In parks and offices across the American landscape, people read these facts in newspapers that still smell of ink and worry about Atlas. Engineers worry differently. They worry about the behavior of thrust chambers under throttle transients and about the way guidance compares commanded pitch to actual pitch when a sensor vibrates at a frequency that dances with combustion's own rhythm. The difference between worry and panic is a discipline of measurement. The stand tests show trends. Trends are treated like living things, watched, coaxed, trimmed. The launcher learns to be less capricious, not by being scolded, but by being modified with parts whose names are never spoken outside of shops that stamp them in serial steel. The escape tower is rehearsed again and again. Its motors are lit in dry runs that tear at the air with their own fierce briefness. The capsule on the pad wears the tower like a guarantor of sanity. No one mistakes it for magic. It is a machine to be measured by the same yardsticks as the rest. The day comes when John Glenn sits in a capsule that has absorbed a year's worth of incremental changes. The pad smells the same: kerosene, paint, ocean. The clamps hold and then do not. The Atlas lights and lifts and sensors that have been watched in tests now perform under loads that have broken their siblings. The Atlas performs well enough to be forgotten by those who will always remember the name, and the capsule coasts into orbit. The American network hears him, a voice calm with training and buoyed by the relief of being where the numbers said he would be. Instruments tell a story the public will call inevitable only after the fact. Life support behaving within margins, temperatures manageable, attitude control thrusters, sipping propellant in a pattern like a heartbeat, becoming steady after a sprint. But the comfort of orbit does not banish the banal creep of concern. A sensor suggests the heat shield might be loose, a possibility that turns the tidy plan for re-entry into a nest of contingencies. The engineers and controllers choose conservatism masked as minimalism. They elect to keep the retro pack attached, to let its straps hold what might be loose until the atmosphere's grip grows confident. The feel inside the capsule, bumps, bangs, flashes of ablating pieces is both expected and unnerving when your putative guarantor is somewhere between physics and a sensor that may be lying. The parachutes bloom as if in response to a prayer. The landing is acceptable, and a boat reaches him because the choreography was drilled dozens of times in seas that would not cooperate. None of this is a miracle. It is a triumph of constraints managed by people who learn to listen to the lessons of every unimportant failure on unimportant days. Between these human flights, dozens of test runs involving engines, chute deployments, water impact tests, and insertion of dummies into seats teaching restraint and harness geometry are made. A mechanic finds a nick in a webbing strap and does not ignore it. A quality inspector rejects a forged fitting that shows a faint crack under dye penetrant. The rejection rate is not a scandal inside, it is a badge of seriousness. The drift toward complacency is fought with boredom's antidote, repetition under scrutiny. Engineers write memos with titles that would put anyone to sleep and thereby preserve a line of knowledge through months where people leave, join, forget, and remember. The organization knits itself through documents so precise they seem pedantic, until they are the only reason two teams separated by time and distance can act like one. On the Soviet side, the line from Vostok does not fork toward more pilot authority. It plows on toward proof that time aloft is not a rare medicine but a dose that can be increased as tolerance grows. The planning reflects confidence in automation and a belief in the idea that the human's primary role is to remain calm and be measured. The idea of layering machines on machines continues to find adherents because it prevents the need to test a pilot's dexterity when the capsule decides to take its own path. There is an envelope sealed for emergency control, and its existence is both a concession and a talisman. The crew selection machinery keeps turning, quiet and precise, placing individuals in seats based on an algorithm made of experiences and judgments that can be written only partially. The work of 100 bench technicians continues to be the true underpinning. Wires bundled, solder joints reflowed, surfaces wiped down with alcohol until they squeak under the cloth. Meanwhile, the American decision to work Atlas into a safer partner for Mercury encourages the quiet forging of procedures that will later become reflex. Controllers learn to trust instruments while remembering that instruments can tell polished lies. The capsule's attitude control system is asked to hold steady against perturbations from solar heating and the shifting of fuel in tanks that screws with expected moments of inertia. Engineers add baffles, not grand ones, just metal plates welded where they will not add too much mass, because slosh matters when gentle pulses are expected to produce calm. You watch charts where small improvements stack into trend lines that move from doubt toward acceptance. The recovery teams refine their hands. Helicopter crews practice the hoist under conditions that foul line and temper. They learn to hover with spray smashing against windshields. Swimmers learn when to cut the parachute lines and when to leave them as anchors. Doctors board with kits stocked for everything from shock to a minor scrape that needs a bandage made of gauze that sticks in salt air. The packaging of these kits is its own science. A mispacked box is a myth turned into an immediate inconvenience. Someone's job is to check the expiration date on a vial that no one has ever needed at sea and to replace it on a schedule that owes its roots to pharmacy and its branches to the knowledge that equipment ignored becomes equipment unreliable. In all this, you see how little of the space race is a duel and how much is a factory that meets the sky. The American factory adds a line for orbital, not because a president demanded it one day, but because 100 managers found ways to move budgets and people just enough to build density at the right points. The Soviet factory does the same without the press releases, applying pressure where it is most useful, at the joints where systems meet, where a misfit bolt can masquerade as a design flaw. The world watches for banners and numbers of firsts. The builders work for margins and reductions in variance. You feel the pull toward the next set of problems that are both larger and more abstract. Radios that can handle 2 ships at once, because someday two will fly together. Propulsion that can restart because someday a correction will not be optional. Heat shields that can tolerate returns from speeds not yet reached because orbits will be higher and translations faster. It looks like a list that belongs in a planning meeting and not in a dream. But the dream, stripped of its costume, is lists, and men and women pulling lines through time, binding them to decisions that can be audited in the dullest of ways. The glory will always find a place in the retelling. The real presenteeism of glory is in a technician's decision to walk back to a bench to re-torque a fastener because his hand told him, in a feeling without a word, that the first pull was not quite right. What rises now is the thought you cannot escape. In the quiet churn of normalization, a suborbital becomes orbit, and the voice loops become quieter because confidence thickens. How will these teams hold on to the fear that once kept them honest without letting it own them? Especially when the next step demands more risk and more docking, more spacewalks, more chances to confuse procedure with safety, when safety is always something earned anew. You arrive at a time when repetition has become the measure of courage. The firsts are behind you, the first orbit, the first suborbital hop, the first American circumnavigation of the Earth. What remains is to prove that these were not stunts but the opening steps of a routine that can be trusted. The rooms you enter now have fewer visitors from the press and more from logistics. On chalkboards and clipboards, the script is less about astonishment and more about margin. You find that the shape of a successful spaceflight looks like a tidy list. Cabin pressure nominal, environmental systems stable, orbit within expected parameters, fuel consumption predictable, communications pathways clear. The charm of that tidiness masks the complexity beneath it. To make the improbable ordinary, people will spend long days on tasks the world rarely notices. On the Soviet side, the Vostok series deepens its proof. After Gagarin's solitary orbit, the plan grows to include prolonged stay and simultaneous flights, the kinds of exercises that turn demonstration into cadence. German Titov spends hours in orbit that stretch from a single pass to a sequence that test the body's patience for weightlessness. The reports that come back are frank in their way, the nausea that announces itself uninvited, the fatigue that feels different when there is no weight to press against, the strain of long solitude inside a guided machine. These are not failings, they are data, and data is the currency engineers spend to buy predictability. Vostok 3 and Vostok 4 place two men in orbit at once, not docked, not close in the sense of touching, but close enough to listen across radio. The separation is a reminder that orbital mechanics is not the same as roads on
Earth. You can be near and still impossibly far unless you're...
velocities and altitudes are tuned with a precision that only practice can teach. The ground cheers the coincidence and the careful choreography, because even this partial closeness demands a network of stations, the pre-arranged handovers, and the patience to accept that the sky does not yield to romance in a hurry. For the ground crews, the two-track ballet means duplicated checklists and parallel loops, and the discipline to keep each sequence clean even as voices cross at the edges. Then comes a mission named not by a number but by the fact of who is aboard. Vostok 6 carries Valentina Tereshkova, and in the unruffled notes of planning, you can discern the quiet weight of a first that is as political as it is technical. The capsule does not grow gentler because of its passenger. The survival kit still includes the same rations and the same slightly awkward items that one would need if landing out in forests or steppe, the same pistol and the same dense cookies. She does what many have done before in the training halls, sits inside a mock-up, memorizes the steps, rehearses under instruction, embraces the expectation that feelings will be noted and managed rather than indulge themselves. The launch is routine in the way that hides sweat and practice. The orbit stretches, and the task is not to inspire, but to endure and to report. When she lands miles from the planned point, Villagers offer hospitality because that is what people do when a stranger arrives out of the sky, and the program folds their kindness into an anecdote while the logisticians measure how far recovery teams had to travel and whether maps can be refined. The Heat to American Mercury program advances with a similar focus on closure, tying off uncertainties, drilling procedures until anyone could recite them in their sleep. Scott Carpenter's flight demonstrates, as much as anything, the fragility of perfect plans when attention must be split between science and piloting. The experiment list is not long, but time and fuel are both elastic if you're not careful. Small attitude deviations add up. Thrusters consume propellant with an honesty that makes no allowances for curiosity. The words spoken afterward are measured, and the lessons drawn are practical. Simplify, prioritize, respect the budget of mass and fuel as if it were money at the end of a month, because it is. Hardware responds to accounting discipline, not to longing. Wally Schirr's mission answers those lessons in the most sober of ways, by being an exercise in precision. The capsule is held to attitudes with discipline. Fuel is saved by avoiding needless firings. The phrase, textbook flight, is earned not by luck, but by the faithful execution of procedures that are the same under pressure as they were in rehearsal. The few deviations are noted as they occur, logged with calm and then forgotten because they are corrected quickly. It is not thrilling, and that is the point. When a system matures, thrill should move to the edges. In offices where engineers keep tally, the confidence in the vehicle's capability and the team's habits grows a fraction. The only way it can, by small increments verified by numbers and not by elation. Gordon Cooper's long-duration Mercury mission extends the test, becoming an endurance run that leans into the limitations of a cabin too small for the mind to forget itself for long. The operations that had been tolerable over hours now demand conservation and patience. The checklist remains the anchor. A human spends a day and some in a tinier world than most can imagine, and the ground team spends the same interval managing handovers among stations, keeping clocks aligned, making sure the messages transmitted from one place arrive at another with enough clarity that errors will not accumulate. These are the hours when coffee is poured quietly and the night shift departs with a nod, and the arriving shift sits down without comment because the continuity of the work is the only real comfort. Between these visible arcs is the work of recovery and survival, the dull and vital layers that keep the romance of space from becoming an obituary too often. In the American program, water egress drills become second nature. Men in suits climb into pools, roll upside down, fumble with buckles that their fingers know but their brains cannot recall when inverted. They practice counting their breaths, holding panic at arm's length with the force of repetition. The ocean recovery forces, more anonymous than anyone else in the chain, refine their patterns. Helicopter crews rehearse under conditions that would make sensible hobbyists stay home. Downwash fighting wave tops, spray-making instruments sticky, the hoist cable rising and falling with a rhythm that seems invented just to embarrass confidence. A man in fins and a flotation collar learns to skim the surface without tiring, a skill that is more useful than any clever quip at a press conference. In the Soviet system, survival is a terrestrial art. The assumption is that a capsule can land on almost any patch of forest or steppe with equal stubbornness. Cosmonauts train to live off the land for a night or two, a week in bad luck with kits that are sturdy and coarse. They learn to fish with improvised tools, to make fires in damp conditions, to treat their own small injuries, to wait without wasting energy. The capsules carry items that look absurd in a museum and reasonable in a storm. A bright cloth to signal a search plane, a small stove, hardened rations, a first aid kit that cares more for practicality than comfort. Ground crews fold these items into canvas with neat hands and do not think of them again unless they have to. It is better not to have to. Meanwhile, technicians in both programs perform continuous quality rituals. Solder joints are inspected under magnification for voids that would carry no current in cold. Harnesses are laced with a reverence that comes from knowing how vibration eats any slack with unseemly appetite. In capsule shops, the smell of epoxy is a constant, and workers learn to read the cure not from a clock alone, but from how it takes a fingerprint that isn't quite a print anymore. In engine rooms, combustion stability is hunted the way a farmer hunts a persistent weed, never decisively victorious, always mitigated, managed, held at a distance by combinations of baffles and feed schedules and injector geometries that will never be romantic in a retelling. The ground networks develop personalities. Stations in unlikely places become more than dots on a map. They become teams with habits. A station in the Caribbean knows the pattern of afternoon storms and keeps a tarp over a vulnerable transformer because the replacement lead time is months and the next pass is in hours. A site in Australia learns that certain insects love cables and responds with screens improvised from materials that were meant to patch fences. Operators write notes to each other, taped to racks that say things like, "This relay sticks when humidity is above 80%.
Tap here with an arrow drawn to a corner.
These notes are not in any manual, and angels of redundancy look kindly upon those who write them. In the meeting rooms where the trajectory is set for the future, the conversation is no longer about whether humans can survive at all in orbit. The questions change flavor. How do you bring two craft together in a sky where straight lines are lies? What thrusters and computers and sighting methods do you need to make that delicate dance repeatable? If you cannot stay outside a capsule for more than minutes without exhaustion, how do you change the suit, the handholds, the choreography? These are not rhetorical. They are lists, and next to each line on those lists are brackets for dates and budgets and names of responsible engineers. There is also a politics of risk that evolves. In the early days, any mishap would have been interpreted as proof that space was inherently rebellious, and perhaps not for humans at all. Now, with a stack of successes and a better catalogue of failures that did not end in loss of life, the tolerance for trying more difficult things rises gently. Managers learn to shield their teams from demands that cannot be met without gambling against physics. Engineers learn to present their arguments in language that respects fear, while asking to move a fraction closer to it. The culture of both organizations matures in directions that reflect their origins, one more open to the negotiation of roles between pilot and machine, the other more willing to let automation carry the burden while providing a sealed set of tools for truly bad days. You should not miss the small domestic realities threaded through all this. The cafeteria at a test site offers the same stew 3 days in a row because supply trucks were delayed, and nobody complains loudly because the schedule is tight and fuel shipments take priority. A seamstress in a suit room pricks her finger and tapes it without fuss because the white glove must stay clean and the schedule does not notice blood that stops on its own. A clerk in a storeroom checks off a crate of resistors and notices that a specification has changed, a small line in a manufacturer's sheet that will matter for thermal drift at high altitude. She flags it, and the ripple turns into an order for a different batch. You will never know her name, and she has perhaps saved a signal from wandering off frequency at a bad moment. As the Mercury program closes, it does so not with a flourish, but with a stable floor. The final flights show that the system as built can be counted on within its narrow limits. The American side looks forward to a program with a twin crew and a target for rendezvous, to learning to dock and to change orbits with purpose. The Soviet side, having proven duration and plural flights, will pivot toward their own next machines, carrying with them the lessons learned in forests and at pads, in the patient attitudes of stations, and in the understanding that survival is built from dull parts and careful hands. You carry from this chapter not a singular image, but a collage, a capsule bobbing in the green smear of a dye marker, a parachute ballooning over a flat horizon, a row of oscilloscopes with their traces steady, A technician adding one last lacing stitch to a harness because it will make no measurable difference and will nonetheless be right. If you listen closely, you can hear in the steady voice of the last Mercury controller a tone of completion, a handing off to something that will demand more of everyone. The next step has a shape that feels unnatural but necessary. Two craft drifting toward each other, their velocities aligned, their relative motion subdued from kilometers per second to centimeters. Two teams on the ground keeping their breath measured as if that might help the dance in the sky remain smooth. What then is the craft of closing distance in a place where there are no landmarks and no friction, where every push changes everything. And how will people learn to work outside their small tin rooms without shedding
Strength faster than time can repay. How will you key the wow?
dullness that made survival possible and extend it into the ballet of rendezvous and walking in space? You stand in a factory where nothing looks like the word space should fit. There are rolls of fabric, bins of zippers, racks of gloves stretched around wooden forms. The room smells faintly of rubber and talc. A seamstress leans forward, inspecting stitches in a pressure suit that will not tolerate vanity. Every seam must hold when air becomes a precious mechanical thing rather than the scenery of life. She is part of a new craft, making garments that are neither elegant nor forgiving, outfits designed to become personal spacecraft. The thread is waxed, the needle is thin, the patience is thick. When she ties off a stitch, she tugs with the same firmness an astronaut will later use to clip a tether to a handrail, because in both cases there is no appetite for almost. On another bench a few rooms away, a technician in a lab coat lays out a set of small latches and spring-loaded hooks. To the untrained eye, they look like parts for luggage. In truth, they are the difference between a person staying attached to a craft and drifting off in silence. Each hook is cycled thousands of times in a jig that measures spring force and latch closure. The numbers are recorded on a chart where only a certain range is acceptable. Too tight, and a gloved hand cannot operate the latch without a struggle that saps oxygen and strength. Too loose, and the latch becomes a rumor rather than a guarantee. You begin to appreciate that a spacewalk, a word already romantic in headlines, is a slow mosaic of small hardware behaving as designed. The Soviet path to this moment is called Voskhod, a name that conceals the compromises underneath. Where Vostok had room for one person, Voskhod squeezes more into its volume. First, 3 in suits that are thinner than anyone would prefer, then 2 with an airlock jammed into a space never meant for it. The airlock itself is a soft, inflatable cylinder, more like a camping accessory than a vault. Engineers practice inflating it in a warehouse, watching for wrinkles that might collapse under pressure, measuring the rate at which it breathes when connected to modest pumps and bottles of air that cannot be wasted. The procedure for moving from cabin to lock to space is rehearsed until it reads as a liturgy. Close inner hatch, check seal, equalize pressure, open outer hatch, clip tether, step out. There is nothing in the words to suggest that the first human to attempt this, Alexei Leonov, will face a problem that begins in the patience of a sewing room and ends in a fight for control of his own body. On the American side, a different program is spooling up its lessons. Gemini is not a grand concept at first. It is a response to a list of needs. 2 people must fly together long enough to test the atmosphere of survival and cooperation. The craft must change its orbit with intention, not just ride the path it was granted by the first burst of fire. Most of all, 2 spacecraft must learn to meet as if there were roads in the sky, traffic rules everyone accepts. Rendezvous is a word used casually in conversation. In engineering, it becomes geometry and patience. The orbits are solved not with dreams, but with vectors. Approaching a target is counterintuitive. To catch up, you drop lower. To rise to meet, you slow. The practice feels like walking on an escalator that changes speed when you move, a system hostile to instinct. The men who sit at their consoles teach pilots new instincts. Their voice is steady because a steady voice becomes a control surface when nothing else feels solid. The Titan II booster that will lift Gemini is itself an exercise in therapy. In earlier tests, it shook with pogo oscillations, pressure waves in propellant lines that set up vibrations strong enough to turn a pilot's stomach into a barometer and a structure into a tuning fork. Baffles are added, accumulators installed, control loops adjusted. Men with ear protection stand near test stands and nod when the sound changes by a pitch that only experience can hear. The goal is for you never to notice the rocket as a personality when you sit atop it. If it behaves well, it will feel like a platform quietly removed from beneath you after doing its job. Before any astronaut reaches for a handrail, engineers learn to simulate weightlessness on Earth in increasingly practical ways. Water tanks become laboratories. Neutral buoyancy leads to neutral surprises. A diver in a pressurized suit tries to turn a wrench underwater and discovers that even small tasks are tiring when your limbs push against resistance you can't feel in space. Bolts that are perfect in a workshop become stubborn underwater. The wrench floats when dropped in a tank and drifts irretrievably in vacuum. So a table of handholds is compiled. Foot restraints are designed to accept a boot and resist a twist. Tethers are cut to lengths that balance freedom with control. Nothing here is left to genius because genius fails in thick gloves. The knowledge is in habits and fixtures and tiny redesigns tested by men who will spend hours breathing their own air, behind visors that fog if they laugh at the wrong moment. Voskhod. 2 lifts from a pad that smells of old fuel and new paint. The airlock inflates, and Leonov pushes himself into a world that does not push back. The first minutes are a careful joy, the view shockingly large, the world curved and serene, the suit inflating as designed. Then a trend begins.
Heat builds.
The suit balloons beyond its expected volume, stiffening the joints as if a prankster had swapped a living person for a mannequin.
A human body needs to bend.
An inflated suit needs to hold air. The engineering line between these two truths is a seam and a set of zippers that must not fail. Leonov's fingers report that they are far from the controls he needs. He bends as little as possible and as much as required. He opens a valve to bleed pressure in a measured disobedience to standing orders that were written for another day. Air hisses out into a place where it will never be recovered. The suit softens into something he can manage. He returns, breath ragged, heart rate a drum. The outer hatch closes. The inner hatch refuses to humor a gentle hand at first. He insists with technique, learn to replace force. The hard part is not the step into the dark. It is the return through an opening designed by numbers that did not include fear. Re-entry is a test of procedure under stress multiplied by complication. Automation stumbles. Manual control is invoked in a time and place where time and place are the difference between a landing and an unplanned camping trip. The capsule returns not to a waiting convoy, but to a forest with snow deep enough to muffle sound and trees close enough to snag a parachute like polite thieves. 2 men sit in their seats and feel the cold begin a negotiation. The radio is not heroic.
It crackles if it works.
The kit is opened, its contents suddenly making sense. A saw, a stove, rations meant to outlast optimism, orange and red cloths that ask passing eyes to notice. They spend a night, then another, as planners almost allowed themselves to forget was possible. Rescue arrives in the shapes of men on skis, tired and efficient, who bring warmth measured in blankets and broth, and who do not expect to be thanked with a speech. In Houston, a room is being prepared where lights will glow for rendezvous. The walls are unadorned. The tables are scratched from earlier projects. There is a large window that looks into another room where technicians move with unconcern because their duties are separate from the performance that will play on the other side of the glass. The man at the center, the director, does not plan to speak loudly. He plans to speak clearly. Around him, systems engineers have developed a habit of saying copy in a tone that neither doubts nor worships. A plan is written where two spacecraft will launch, one an Agena target vehicle with a radio that speaks in a different dialect, the other a Gemini with thrusters tuned to a life in gentle pulses and computers that compute slowly but with sufficient patience. The plan presumes failure and writes branches for it, because space does not care whether the plan is an inspiration. Ed White steps outside first for an American walk, his tether a lifeline and a leash that coils when it should curve and snags when it should float. He uses a small propulsion gun, a kind of handheld optimism, and discovers that maneuvering a human body in a stiff suit under sun is work in capital letters. His breath quickens. The visor fog creeps, a half-remembered classroom lesson about condensation, suddenly a personal experience. He grins for a camera, because a camera demands it, and because joy is real, even when measured by heart rate. He returns reluctantly because all first explorers must be pulled back from the urge to turn a demonstration into a residency. The engineers watch with pens hovering above forms. The tethers need to be less like rope and more like a designed thing. The handholds too few and poorly placed. The procedures glossy but untested in the reality of a human working against time. When the time comes to meet another craft in orbit, the math plays favoritism with those who understand it. The first tries are rough. Pilots who are artists at atmospheric flight confess later that they moved too much or too early, or in the direction their intuition demanded rather than the one the numbers required. Controllers say gently, point at the target and you will not get there. Satisfy the relative velocity first. The cockpit becomes a classroom. The target brightens and dims in the window. Instruments more faithful than eyes teach that closing when you want to close is not the same as closing safely. After hours of approach fed through small thruster whispers, a nose and a cone meet and accept each other with a thunk that is both a sound and a decision. The latches engage. Kerosene and helium and computing one layer above Abacus have conspired with schedule and coffee to make this possible. The room below the big window does not stand. They make small noises, the sort people make when an expected outcome has become real and therefore less likely to be taken away by fate. On the ground, the work that made this possible looks like 1,000 operations that consumed whitish mornings and scruffy afternoons. A machinist adjusted the taper of a docking cone blossom so it would present more forgivingly to a nose that would likely not be perfect. A software coder in a room without windows wrote a routine to prevent a thruster from firing twice in error when a switch bounces under vibration. A welder, a woman with a steady hand, put down a bead that ran true around a pressure vessel fitting, her mask reflecting a blue that looks the same in every country. A clerk filed a test report with a paperclip, the dull clink a punctuation mark at the end of a process that shielded no egos. A training diver added a loop of Velcro to a glove that had already passed testing because he saw a man fumble, and knew that a loop would give him a place to catch with a finger and keep hold. Voskhod pauses in its own rhythm after the second flight, its accomplishments wrapped in confidential memos and public announcements that lean more heavily on narrative than on numbers. Gemini accelerates into a tempo that will turn rendezvous into something like a craft anyone can learn, provided they allow their stubbornness to be refashioned by calculus. In the corners of rooms away from cameras, doctors make notes on the microbes that find their way into recirculated air. The taste of water when stored in tanks lined with materials that must be light and not leach. The psychology of people in close quarters kept busy by checklists and timers, and the habit of jokes that wear out their welcome in 3 days. The next steps are already visible if you look. Walking not merely for joy, but for work, for attaching things to things, for moving in and out of vehicles as if it were not a miracle that the hatch opens to the void and someone does not fall out. New tools are designed with handles a glove can love, with heads that index into shapes, rather than needing to be lined up by an eye that cannot judge distance easily when everything is too black or too bright. The plan includes failures that are survivable: fogged visors, tangled tethers, exhausted bodies, and procedures for reversing the path. Stop, rest, reorient, return. You learn that safety is a script, not a feeling, performed under stress until it looks like character. What is still unsettled is the dance between machine and human for the coming work. Will the machine dictate the rhythm and the person comply, or will the person demand a measure of improvisation and the machine tolerate it? The airlock, the tether, the handrail, and the valve do not care. They require hands with muscle left in them and minds that can accept the way a horizon moves when you pivot at a touch. As the rendezvous becomes smoother and the first spacewalks move from novelty into problem-solving, you feel the coming need for a method that turns exhaustion into repetition, a way to make the outside of a spacecraft as routine as the inside. How will teams find that method and teach it, so that the next excursions can repair, construct, and return without treating survival as a close call each time? You begin in a hangar, where the useful smell of solvents and cold metal hangs just above your shoulders. On one side, technicians lean over a conical docking adapter, whose petals open and close with the neatness of a well-kept pocket knife. On another, a cylindrical target vehicle sits on a cradle while wiring harnesses are laced and relaced until each tie-off sits exactly where the print says it should be. Nothing about this feels like history. It feels like manufacturing with a calendar pressed to its back. The term rendezvous, so casual in conversation, here resolves into parts: the target that must survive ascent, the interceptor that must mind its fuel in the small sips of thruster firings, the mathematics that must be turned into needles and dials that a pilot can trust under stress. The ground learns that rendezvous is not a single idea. It is a chain of dependability where each link must be dull enough to be reliable. You stand inside the simulator where Gemini crews become competent by repeating movements until nobody has to think about them. There is a small hand controller that sends signals to attitude thrusters, a set of 8 balls of propellant aimed in pairs to rotate the craft. The logic is not intuitive at first. To close with a target that is ahead of you, you do not point your nose at it and accelerate. You press yourself into a lower orbit to gain speed, rising later. To catch up with something below you, you climb and accept that higher orbits run slower against the ground. The old instincts of a pilot must be worn down gently and replaced with a new reflex that thinks in ellipses instead of in vectors that assume friction. A voice in your headset coaxes your hands into the right small movements, while a series of marker lights tells you more truth than the bright shape in your window. You practice until the move and wait rhythm becomes a comfort, and impatience feels like a hazard. On the pad, the Titan II that will carry Gemini has shed its worst habit: pogo, the oscillation that shook earlier tests. The fix was dull and hard, accumulators added to the propellant lines like lungs that smooth breath, injector baffles modified with shapes that look random but are not, control loop gains adjusted by small amounts that engineers defend with plots, not poetry. When it works, nothing is dramatic. The rocket rises without the teeth-clattering shiver that once rattled fixtures in nearby buildings. The pad crew learned a ritual of pressurization, of helium bottles that must be filled and checked, and valves that must be stroked so their seals remember what it is to move. In the hours before each launch, the ritual looks like men and women checking gauges, writing down numbers, and asking for readings again, because asking again is cheaper than explaining later. The early rendezvous rehearsal tries hard to be ordinary and refuses. The first target, an Agena booster with docking hardware, is lost minutes after launch when a structural failure turns thrust into debris. The sound of that loss isn't an explosion. It is paper. It is the rustle of revised plans and the click of phones as a launch director tells teams that a day, then a week, must be reshaped. The crew scheduled to chase that target sits in quarters where the television is turned down and the coffee grows cold. You mark how quickly an organization that wants to move forward turns into one that wants to move correctly. The next attempt is reconfigured on the fly. Gemini 6A will not chase an Agena at all, but will instead seek Gemini 7, a living target that will be aloft for 2 weeks. An endurance test that will turn small inconveniences into big lessons. You join the Gemini 7 crew during their long arc of days in a cabin that has exactly as much room as needed and no more. The details here are not grand, they are vital. The new fuel cells turn oxygen and hydrogen into water and electricity in a reaction that pretends to be humble and turns out to be transformative. Batteries alone could not sustain the planned durations. Fuel cells do, but they are picky. They do not like contamination. They sulk if temperatures wander. So the crew and ground watch the numbers with a shared worry that gradually drains away as the devices prove themselves. The rest is about people in a metal room, the nuisance of scratchy beards that cannot be shaved without thought for floating hair, the way a small itch under a suit cuff becomes a philosophical problem, the choreography of toilet functions in a space so close it deserves a euphemism and receives instead a checklist segment. That is all numbers and plastic connections. Gemini 6A joins the sky where Gemini 7 has been living, and the rendezvous unfolds in slow satisfaction. It is not a docking, it is a dance. The approach is measured by speech in tenths and hundredths. The pilots learn to trust their instruments over their eyes because the target's position against the clouds plays optical tricks. The final approach is a sequence of small firings and small weights. They slide to within a handful of feet, then hold station, learning how a breath in one ship becomes a drift in the other. The thrill is subtle. 2 human beings in one capsule can now stare into the windows of another and know that both are where the math said they would be. On the ground, the network's handovers are a model of cooperation. Voices you have never met sound like old friends because repetition makes strangers into colleagues. Then comes a lesson that nobody wanted and everyone needed. Gemini 8 rises neatly, meets its Agena neatly, and then finds itself caught in a personality contest between its own thrusters and a stuck-on cabin thruster that insists on firing. The docking, a moment of precision, is followed by a tumble that builds seconds into disaster. The crew tries to isolate the cause, the target, or us. They undock and discover the problem is homegrown. The roll accelerates. Stars smear into rings. The training intervenes. The commander decides, calmly and with a speed nobody knew was possible until it happened, to shut down the attitude system that refuses to obey and to use the re-entry thrusters to kill the spin. He wins the argument with physics in the only way physics accepts, with correctly applied force. The price is the mission. The re-entry system is spent. The result is a return to Earth far earlier than planned. In the minutes that follow, you hear voices that should sound panicked and do not. You see the outlines of the next day's meetings where designers will add guards, reroute wiring, and change switches, all because one stuck thruster in a single ship wrote a chapter no one wanted. While the Gemini flights teach rendezvous as a craft, spacewalks reveal themselves as labor. The suits were barely up to the task. A pilot stepping outside with a tether around his waist finds that the human body, even fit and disciplined, meets a peculiar fatigue when it must move a pressurized garment that wants to remain a balloon. Glove fingers turn into unwilling sticks. Wrist joints refuse to cooperate the way they did in the neutral buoyancy pool. Visors fog from exertion. Heart rates push into zones that make controllers frown, and doctors make notes on forms that begin recommendation. Checklists that look tidy on paper turn into paragraphs that must be cut and
rewritten with verbs like rest and stabilize added.
You watch as handholds proliferate and foot restraints get redesigned to accept a boot from different angles. Tools get lanyards to prevent drift. Timelines grow the buffer that becomes the difference between a heroic struggle and a competent job. Meanwhile, Small technical burdens continue their quiet insistence. Thruster-fuel slosh affects fine control as tanks deplete. Baffles appear in late drawings like afterthoughts and become the obvious choice in a month. Guidance computes slowly and correctly, but crews learn to accept that onboard computers do not match the fantasy of automation. They are assistants, not bosses. Dowdy details become ladders of safety, check valves of a slightly different alloy because the original formulation embrittled under cycling. Insulation on wires reformulated because original sheathing cracked after repeated thermal shocks. A technician spots a hairline craze in a plastic fitting and refuses to sign the line. The replacement takes a day, and the day turns into a lesson that governs a month. On the Soviet side, Voskod's brief life recedes into notes and quietly celebrated anniversaries. The design bureaus that will produce Soyuz settle into a phase of endurance that looks like tedium and feels like work with a purpose. Simulators teach a different set of instincts, automated more by design, leaving the human in a role part rider, part supervisor, part emergency backup. Ground networks are expanded with ships at sea, dish antennas turning, crews learning to trust signal strength as a sense much like sight. The decision to protect people with more automation has never been simple. It is increasingly justified by the way repetitive work grinds down attention. A person is excellent at surprises and poor at boredom. A machine is the opposite. The program tries to exploit both truths without being betrayed by either. Gemini runs its cadence tighter. Short missions follow long ones. Docking trials follow station keeping. Experiments that sound dull in abstracts turn out to be seeds of routine. The fine art of rendezvous refines itself into a small number of reliable profiles. The phasing orbit, the terminal phase initiation, the last meters where a human eye confirms what the radar and computer would swear to, all become a script performed from memory with checklists kept nearby as a comfort rather than as a prompt. The docking mechanisms receive their own attention, cones polished and slightly retapered, petals with springs tuned so they do not bounce at closure, latches reinforced against the subtle shock of two moving masses deciding to become one temporary mass. The humor in the control room becomes better, less defensive. People permit themselves the luxury of a joke before the numbers come in, and so the threshold of mastery appears less like a single step and more like a worn path. It includes messy memories and a Gina wrapped in a stubborn shroud that refuses to separate, presenting a work of artful mechanical failure that looks like a mouthful of jagged teeth and earns a nickname that sounds like a children's book villain. It includes triumphs nobody pays for with terror, a high apogee boost trial that flirts with the edge of what re-entry heating curves will tolerate, executed with a nonchalance that only comes from method. It includes a pilot, frustrated by a useless propulsive experiment, deciding that the lesson is not in grit but in humility, the acceptance that some tasks wait for a different design. By now, you realize the pattern you first sensed when the first beeps circled the Earth. The sky yields to procedures multiplied until they become culture. Crew selection evolves too. The people who sit in these seats still have test pilot eyes.
Yes, but they also study like electricians.
Like plumbers, like nurses, like machine operators. Because that is what they are when success depends on the right switch at the right instant. Ground controllers grow into their consoles as if they were instruments played well only after scales and etudes have exhausted boredom. The long lists of what-if scenarios get shorter. Not because imagination fades, but because design cuts branches off the tree. What you carry away from this second section of Gemini's education is not a shout, but a nod. Rendezvous can be taught. Docking can be built into hardware. Spacewalking demands a human body be buffered with better tools and kinder suits. The remaining questions are not romantic. They are responsibilities. How do you translate this craft into construction, into building a path for missions to the moon with stages that separate and meet like polite strangers at a train station? How do you take the honest fatigue of a spacewalk and make it manageable for tasks longer than awe will sustain, so that work outside becomes less like a fight and more like a trade? And under the gathering pressure of a deadline that nobody wants to call a race and everyone feels, how will each small lesson hold its shape when the calendar flips faster than prudence prefers? You begin with a spool of Velcro on a workbench and a soldering iron cooling in a cradle. If the romance of spacewalking had to start again from scratch, this is the point where it would begin, with fasteners and handholds, with rails and foot restraints, with a library of techniques that fit the human body when it is encased in a pressurized envelope. The early spacewalks taught a rude truth that exhaustion arrives fast when muscle fights a suit's internal pressure and mind fights disorientation. So the solution is not bravado, it is furniture. Rails appear exactly where elbows can catch and where boots can press without twisting ankles. Restraints become not last-minute add-ons but part of the structure, with edges smoothed and clearances mapped. You see drawings of hatch frames annotated with notes about glove clearance and tether routing, language that reads more like carpentry than like conquest. The training pools grow deeper and their walls sprout mock-ups. Underwater, the suits are balanced with foam and weights until their wearers float neutrally. The tug of buoyancy a fair stand-in for the absence of weight. Instructors become a new species, part diver, part choreographer, part counselor. They teach that good work underwater begins with stillness, that flailing burns oxygen and patience. In the water, a wrench must be tethered and a torso braced. A turn of a bolt must be deliberate and slow to avoid overshooting, because inertia is not a friendly presence. Checklists change in tone. They acquire phrases like position body for torque and rest cadence, notes that would belong in a manual for careful woodworking if they were not destined for space. You begin not with the moon, but with a charred spacecraft sitting behind a glass wall that makes every visitor fall quiet. The burned cabin of a developmental Apollo command module tells a story that is not told in the vocabulary of triumph. It is told in melted wiring, in ruptured hoses, in panels that fused where they should have yielded. The name of the tragedy is a date and a number.
Its cause is not a single villain.
It is a chain of choices that seemed small at the time. Flammable materials used for convenience and tradition, a hatch designed to be strong against the vacuum and slow against the emergency no one believed would happen on the ground. An oxygen-rich environment that had been tolerated because it solved other problems. After the fire, the habits of 1,000 people change. The fragrance of new cloth in suit rooms is different because it does not burn the same way. The sound of a hatch closing changes because it is hinged and latched to open outward in seconds, not minutes. The lexicon of safety replaces the lexicon of speed, and meetings that once rolled by in a rush now stop for questions that prick at pride and at past decisions. The redesign is not a single gesture. It is a series of memos and teardowns, tests that set fire to materials in boxes with hoods above them, wire bundles rerouted and resheathed, connectors respecified, cockpit checklists rewritten to account for steam, formed when water makes acquaintance with electronics. Engineers tear open panels they had put their names to months ago and replace parts with ones that are heavier and more predictable. There is a humble energy in the meetings where old arguments are unlearned. The man who advocated for a particular adhesive now recommends another. The woman who insisted a certain wire gauge was sufficient now calls for a size larger. Assembly lines pause so that training lines can run, because the technicians who will install the new parts must learn new procedures. It is tedious and expensive in the currency of time. It is also an expression of grief converted into care. Meanwhile, the rocket that will carry this renewed ship grows in a cavern so big it makes the air outside seem small. The Saturn V stacks in stages, each stage its own continent of problems. The F1 engines, 5 of them, sit on a thrust structure that looks like a cathedral roof from below. The problem that once stalked small rockets, combustion instability, lurks here too, a devil that makes pressure oscillate without kindness and threatens to tear engines apart. The fix is not discovered in a flash. It is coaxed out by months of baffles soldered into injector plates, by blast rings and acoustic cavities, by men with stethoscopes listening to a firestorm. When the engines stop screaming at each other and start speaking in a single, controlled roar, the test stand vibrates in a way that shakes dust from rafters and makes everyone smile. Not because the noise is beautiful, but because it is consistent. The shape of the exhaust plume becomes a familiar sight. When something so violent can be counted upon to be the same day after day, confidence gathers like dust on boot. The second stage has its own temperament. J2 engines run on liquid hydrogen and oxygen, a pairing that turns into almost magical efficiency when properly mixed. Liquid hydrogen is a trickster, cold enough to make metal uncertain, light enough to leak where no path appears to exist. Storage tanks are insulated as if they were sweaters being knitted for winter. Lines are wrapped and traced with heaters. Sensors are checked not once but repeatedly to fight the creep of frost and the danger of embrittlement. Valves meant to open at precise pressures are tested in baths that mimic the cold. Actuators are rated not for a nominal value, but for a range that includes misbehavior. Gauge needles that seem to move lazily are in fact marking changes large enough to end careers. The delicacy necessary to handle these liquids becomes part of the personality of the program. Forklift drivers learn to avoid rushing near dew-covered lines. Welders attend classes on techniques for aluminum alloys that won't crack when kissed by winter. The assembly of the command and service module, redesigned and wary, takes place in rooms where the noise of the outside world cannot enter. Technicians in smocks wear gloves not for sterility but for cleanliness that keeps dust from compromising connectors. Each wire is tagged. Each tag gains meaning as it matches a line on a diagram that has been revised enough times to show ghostly previous iterations under the new. The service module's engine is a cup of fire designed to light only a few times and never to fail at those moments. Test runs are brief and convincing. Engineers are interested not in what it does when it works perfectly, but in what it does when it is asked to light a second later than planned, or in slightly colder conditions, or after a soak in heat that would cook other hardware. At the Cape, the pads grow cabling like vines from the launch umbilical tower to the rocket's flanks. The checklist for mating the instrument unit to the stack reads like an index to a book about anxiety. Electrical connections verified, hydraulic lines purged, data paths checked with test patterns that appear as dancing bars on screens designed to be boring. The launch team learns the rhythm of scrubs with humility. Lightning threatens. A sensor misreads.
A valve refuses to prove its health.
A scrub is not a failure. It is an investment in safety. The fleet out in the Atlantic and Pacific learns to drift into place on schedules that match orbits that have not happened yet. Tracking ships test radars that will stare up at a dot that must turn into data, that data turning into a course that will carry a crew where calculators and then computers have predicted they should go. When the time comes to fly a crew again, the first step is cautious. A mission in Earth orbit, a walked path rather than a new trail, with the redesigned capsule as the subject. In the weeks before, the warehouse rhythm takes over. Shipping crates unloaded with care, spares tallied on clipboards, a missing crate of connectors found under a tarpaulin because someone drew a marker line incorrectly on a map of the storage yard. The crew learns a cockpit the way you learn a familiar kitchen that has been renovated. The light switch you once hit without thinking is now a plate with 3 toggles. The drawers hold different tools. The oven now needs a preheat longer than you remember. The first reflight of human beings in this program is not glamorous in outline. It is a diary of small successes, the cabin pressure holding, the new hatch seal showing no creep, the new materials refusing to outgaze and fog the windows. If you listen to conversations around the edges, you hear a new wariness that does not manifest as hesitation when a checklist reaches a step that matters. It manifests as a last glance at a gauge before a button press, as a new form at the end of a meeting that asks, without apology, who is responsible for this decision, as a closed-loop call at consoles where every instruction is repeated and acknowledged, not because ritual is beautiful, but because ritual reduces misunderstandings. The space agency, this odd hybrid of laboratories, contractors, and sailors, has reinvented itself in the dullest of ways and therefore in the most durable. Overseas, a different track pushes toward the same sky. The Soviet lunar program, less public and more improvised under pressure, nurtures a heavy booster that does not reward haste. Test stands explode into stories told in corridors. Engines that looked beautiful on paper behave poorly in clusters. The supply chains for welders and alloy billets and quality inspectors stretch thin under demands that were set by a calendar, not by experience. Soyuz, the crude craft, is maturing with its own lessons, some learned with pain. Where one program codifies everything and publishes it in binders, the other writes much of it in notebooks and in habits. Where one builds a ring of stations across oceans, the other leans on ships that turn their dishes slowly against horizons that curl their signals. Both are learning that the moon is a place that can be reached only by a network of ordinary excellence, not by one heroic engine or one clever module. The quiet climax of this section is not a launch. It is a room full of people around a table where the opening question is simple. Are we ready to leave Earth orbit? The answers are in many languages, some of them numbers, some of them feelings earned by seeing hardware behave under tests. One team says that the command and service module has been through enough cycles to trust its engine. Another says the Saturn V still grows with a few habits that should be seen under full cry and not in simulations alone. Someone else says the navigation systems platform drifts at a rate that is small enough to be corrected by procedures that have been taught. These statements are not speeches. They are offerings laid down by people who know what it is to bury colleagues, to remove their names from badges and reassign their desks. The room sits with the weight of these facts and decides in the only way decisions like this can be made, by balancing safety against purpose and admitting that there is no such thing as certainty. So you leave this first part not with a rocket rising, but with a plan thick with caution, driven by the belief that if you have not learned from fire, then you should be still. The question you carry forward is a quiet one that matters more than any countdown. With the redesigns tested and the engines taught to sing a single note, when the moment arrives to ask ordinary procedures to carry you into an extraordinary orbit around another body, will the lessons of patience hold against the appetite to declare that enough is enough and it is time to go? You begin in a room that does not look like a place where bold choices are made. The lights are steady, the air is cool, and the tables are crowded with binders whose edges are frayed. It is autumn after a year of fire and correction, and the newest habit in this house is to ask whether a thing is ready without hoping for yes. The first crewed Apollo mission after the disaster flies in Earth orbit. It is full of tests, and the tests are full of numbers that point quietly to yes. The new hatch opens fast enough to become unremarkable. The thrusters twitch on command without coughing. The guidance platform drifts, but within margins that make sense to pilots and mathematicians both. Ground loops hum without the mid-sentence stutter that once made controllers tap microphones to be sure their own voices still existed. The unspectacular arrival of competence is the lesson in the logbook. The names on the manifests change. The order of flights shifts under pressure that is part technical and part strategic. And the next question grows. Can you trust this ship and this team not only to circle Earth, but to circle the moon? The long meeting where the question is confronted has no speeches anyone remembers. There are lists. One says, re-entry from lunar speed is not the same heat as a fall from low Earth orbit.
Ablators must be thick. where they were previously comfortable being thin.
Another points with a pencil to the navigation platform. It has learned to settle and can be realigned by watching stars through a sextant port that must be polished by hands that understand how easily grit scratches a lens. A third says quietly, "The Saturn V itself has flown only enough to be impressive, not enough to be ordinary. The engines, the staging, the guidance unit that rides like a ring above the third stage, if they are to be trusted for what comes next, their temper must be tested under the XE." There is confession here too. The other side of the world is trying its own path. Uncrewed circumlunar flights using a capsule that is more automated and a booster that has been promised more than it has been proved report outcomes in hints. Some capsules make arcs around the moon and return with trajectories that confirm mathematics.
Some do not.
The silence around failures carries the same tone as whispers around success, uncertain.
Urgent, tracked by radio amateurs and professionals alike.
Recorded in logs by people who never imagined they would be historians. In these corridors, the comparison is not made with flags. It is made with schedules and reliability charts. The question, brutally practical in private, is whether the equipment that exists can do the work now, not in a season or a year, when improvements might be complete. So, out of rooms where caution sits on shoulders like a new uniform, a decision forms, one that will be celebrated later and, in the moment, is carried out with the same pencils and the same routines as any launch. The plan that emerges for a mission late in the year contains words that still feel too big for the line they inhabit. Translunar injection, lunar orbit insertion, return to Earth. The sequence looks like a paragraph of verbs. Light, cut off, settle, rotate, light again. And the months leading into it are spent making the verbs reliable. In factories where electricians label wires using tags printed twice so that any smudge can be read around, a new discipline hardens. In clean rooms where a lens is wiped only by someone who knows that the fiber of a cloth can scratch glass, a lens is wiped as though it were a relic. To make a trip around the moon possible within the geometry of that winter requires an instrument as old as ships, time. The launch window is not just a few hours. It is a map carved into the calendar with lines that depend on angles of sun and earth and moon, on the rules of free return that would slingshot a ship back toward home even if an engine refuses to listen. The tracking network receives its own rehearsal. Stations that once worried only about low Earth passes now prepare for the long silences and the long arcs of deep space. Antennas turn, the hardware that once whispered with the voice of satellites now tuned to listen for a craft farther away than any crew has ever been. The communications gear learns to love smaller signals. Amplifiers grow cool in their racks. Backup paths are checked the way one checks the air in a tire before a long drive out into a desert with no gas stations. The third stage of the Saturn V, the one that will push beyond Earth's hold, becomes a living creature in the eyes of its minders.
It must ignite once, then sleep while the crew checks the ship, then wake again as though it were a person stirring after a short nap.
The restart is a delicate thing. In a fluid line, a bubble can become a symptom of a future regret. Engineers invent exercises for the cold metal, slosh tests, chill-down rehearsals, valves allowed to move at the speed of cold, and then the speed of heat. They learn to love the sound of a clean start, a rush that is smooth rather than ragged, a rising whine that moves through expected notes like a melody someone has played daily for months. The training that the crew undergoes looks, to an outsider, like drudgery arranged on wheels. The simulators are not glamorous. They are boxes filled with wires and cards and screens that glow with the color of fluorescent tubes. In these boxes, men practice failure as a way of life. They die 100 times a week, and not once does anyone wear black. A pump fails, a light lies, a platform drifts, a thruster refuses. A computer gives a number that would be right on a different day at a different angle, and the task is not to solve the problem with flair, but to survive it with discipline. A voice from a back row of a sim room says, "Freeze it there!" and the tape stops, and a question is asked that feels as if it has been asked already and will be asked again. Where in the checklist did you leave yourself behind? On one afternoon that no journalist marks, the loading of a guidance update fails because a connector is not quite seated. The program crashes. The panel goes quiet in a way that would terrify anyone not trained to love quiet, because it means there is a script. A hand checks the plug. Another reads back a step. The sequence resumes. It is petty, and it is the difference between trusting equipment emotionally and trusting it professionally. On another morning, a navigation sighting of a star is off by a sliver because a piece of lint behaved like an asteroid. The lens is cleaned by someone who learned to lift dust by static, not by pressure. The star returns precisely where it should be. The fix is not a story for the evening news. It is a note in a log followed by the same new note. Inspect optics before line of position measurements. Meanwhile, across the world, a capsule tries to circle the moon without a human inside, reporting back in telemetry that must be sniffed from noise, the way you might smell soup in a neighbor's house. Its re-entry capsule comes down in places difficult to find, dragging parachutes that bloom and collapse with the mood of winds. Successes are marked by photographs of the moon taken through windows that did not freeze. Failures are marked by an absence that is itself a report. Inside this other program's offices, the craft that will carry humans is being asked to be ready before it is done, learning how to be a machine. Engineers petition for time. The calendar does not listen. The boosters that promise much with clusters of engines where one must not sabotage another perform like musicians who still look for the conductor. These efforts matter to the decision elsewhere, not because they mock or frighten, but because they tell the truth about how hard such a thing really is. When the American December launch rises into air that is cool and hard, the roll program begins. The numbers track within the lanes drawn by guidance tables, and the third stage does what it was taught. The coast before the second ignition is as tense as any countdown. The call for restart is made. The engine awakens. The long push begins. The guidance beams this annex of Earth onto a long ellipse that reaches for the moon, and the ground grows small faster than people inside the room, outside the glass, can feel comfortable with. The tracking network hears the new Doppler shift, the new distance, the echoes in the data changing character. Controllers mark down the successful burn in the same even handwriting they would use to indicate a minor checkpoint in a test of a cooling loop. The magnitude of the moment is forced to live inside a routine, not to keep it small, but to make it survivable. Navigation is now a conversation with stars and the narrow moon looming ahead. The platform inside the ship precesses, is re-zeroed, is watched for drift. Sightings are taken through optics that must not fog, not scratch, not gather tears that would scatter light like a cheap stage trick. The computer is fed. It returns numbers. The numbers are compared with numbers brought from Earth. Corrections are made. Propellant pulses nudge the path. Little exhausted jets of gas, boring, predictable, undramatic, determine whether the burn that captures the craft into lunar orbit will be measured in seconds in the right way. When that burn arrives, there is a silence where radio cannot reach. On the far side, the moon blocks the line of sight, and in that shadow, the engine that was qualified in test cells behaves as it behaved when watched by men with notebooks. The ship falls into an ellipse that is not an idea but a curve, measured in miles and minutes. On the near side, the signal returns like a friend at a door, and people who are not supposed to cheer allow themselves a small exhale. The task in lunar orbit is not poetry, it is cartography by steady gaze. Photographs are taken not because they are beautiful, but because they measure slopes and shadows and topographical subtleties that can turn a landing from a simulation into an improvisation. A site that looked smooth becomes, under a low sun, a field of angles. Another that read bumpy becomes, when seen at a different hour, a plane. The onboard cameras are managed like scientific instruments. Film is finite. The motion of the window past a feature is incorrectable by willpower. The camera operator becomes a machine that loves the tick of a metronome. On the ground, a team watches the images as they arrive in their slow procession and marks them on maps with pencils that must be sharpened halfway through a pass. Back on Earth, another crew broods over a test it will soon perform, a rehearsal that holds everything except the last act. They will take a lunar module into orbit around the moon, separate from the command ship, and perform a dance that must become muscle memory. Descent engine test, ascent engine test, rendezvous, docking. The spacecraft, built for the last 300 feet above the surface, must prove itself in the clean geometry of a vacuum above an alien horizon where nobody can walk out and turn a valve by hand. Workmen on the assembly floors strip protective covers from descent engine nozzles, torque bolts with wrenches that remember the correct number by voice and click, and sign tags that hang from lines like laundry hung to dry in a winter sun. The return from the moon, the first return from that winter flight, is conducted with the same shameless love of procedure. Mid-course corrections by twitch and whisper, roll maneuvers to distribute heat evenly across a skin that must land like a meteor and live. The capsule targets a patch of ocean that ships already mark with grease pencil on bridge windows. Recovery crews put on helmets without ceremony, hold on to straps in helicopters that kick against gusts, and look down into a blue that is cold and indifferent. The skin of the capsule that has seen flame goes dull and rough. If you ran your hand across it, it would feel like the grit of new concrete. The crew is winched out of the water into a cabin that smells like hydraulic fluid and rubber. The voices climb from radio into air. Heads nod. Someone hands someone else a towel because even now, form matters. On the desks and in the drawers afterward, two kinds of notes are filed, the lyrical and the practical. The lyrical are the letters written without being written. Yes, this can be done and has been done.
Look, we were there.
The practical are the improvements discovered not by triumph or error, but by friction. A page says, the sequence for the data uplink on the outbound leg should be moved earlier. Another says, in the dark pass over the Pacific, the temperature drifted by an amount that suggests an extra minute should be given before a heater is switched off. There is a third category, quieter still. The judgments of men who stood at windows and saw a surface under sunlight and decided that a different approach angle would be better for a landing, not because the math is wrong, but because the texture looks unkind in a way only an eye can sense. Parallel to this, in factories and offices that do not leak information, and in fields where rescue helicopters do not fly, a separate set of troubles hunts a separate set of dreams. A capsule meant to carry a man around the Earth fails early in its life in ways that break hearts in rooms where work was done, as well as it could be under pressure that did not understand how time buys safety. An effort to build a booster whose engines cluster like grapes under a lattice of structure becomes a treatise on the limits of simultaneous invention. Vibration and plumbing and control conspire to make each test stand a place where hope must always be qualified. Engineers there are not less competent. They are trapped by the same truth everyone around the world is trapped by, that physics is patient and calendars are not. The plainest outcome of this winter mission, in the end, is not a photograph. It is a statement in the minutes of a meeting. The navigation worked. The thermal control worked. The guidance platform drift was manageable. The third stage restarted. The return corridor was correct. The network was sufficient. The bloom of poetry around the moment is allowed, but the real blossom is lists. And under those lists is the steady question that has been following you through every corridor of this building since the fire in the test bay was turned into new procedures. Having gone around the moon and come home by the book? Who will hold the line on patience when the next book has a chapter with a title that reads, in quiet font, powered descent to the surface, with contingency lines attached beneath that nobody wants to read aloud, but everyone must understand. You enter a room where the floor is painted with scuff marks that match the soles of boots that have not yet stepped on the moon. The practice here is not theatrical, it is domestic. A ladder mock-up leans at the correct angle. A handrail is placed lower than seems dignified because that is where it will be reachable while wearing a pressurized suit. The suits themselves have matured into a new grammar. Convolutes at joints that flex in stagey bellows, connector rings that latch with a twist, and a click felt more than heard. A liquid cooling garment that looks like a mesh but is, in truth, a circulatory system that carries heat away like a river carries silt. A man steps down the ladder into a sandbox whose grains are chosen for their stubbornness. He practices catching himself with gloved hands and remembers to look at the horizon to calm the inner ear. He wears a pack that is louder than memory suggests because fans make noise and relief. The lunar module, that angular creature, is the house you must learn more intimately than any home. It is a pressure vessel sitting on legs that understand impulse through crushable honeycomb. Its descent engine is throttleable, an uncommon luxury that took years to tame. It will be lit at a height that cannot be judged by looking out a window the way one would judge a tree from a porch. So a radar is bolted to a frame, its signals interpreted by a computer that is a stack of woven ropes of memory and a logical heart that will be asked to juggle more than it was ever promised. In the simulator, targets are missed and then met.
Radars are covered and then uncovered.
The crew's hands learn to watch the computer and the ground and the lamps at once. The decision whether to continue or to abort is made 100 times before it is made once. On the day it is finally made for real, 2 men climb into a cockpit that looks like an exercise in denial of aesthetics.
Labels look lettered by stencils because they are.
The control is a stick that remembers fine motion. The displays are numbers that sit like small squares of sunlight. The descent begins with a burn gauged to erase enough speed to permit a fall that can be controlled. There is texture in the room back on Earth as the guidance calls arrive. Altitude, velocity, fuel remaining. Something else appears too, warnings that carry a new grammar. Alarms that announce the computer is seeing more tasks than it can treat as urgent. The checks drilled into minds insist that these are not fatal provided they do not multiply or persist. Voices remain low. A controller reviews in a half-second an entire chapter of memory that was written weeks before and rewritten in the last rehearsal. The crew continues because the margin remains and the computer is not asking for an apology. The surface, seen obliquely, is not as smooth as the photograph suggested. It is littered with rocks that cast shadows that stress the eyes. The landing point that would have been easy to accept in simulation now looks impolite in person. The pilot adjusts, trading horizontal velocity for lateral displacement, and the descent engine blows dust that behaves like a shy animal. It rises, it hangs, it slides, it masks the ground, and it does not swirl as it would in air. The last seconds are long because the brain knows that any mistake here would cost everything, and the hands know that the only way to stop time is to make the machine rest. The legs touch, crush, core absorbs, telemetered bits become a number that suggests wait. The calls are cool because they must be, and a sentence goes out that will be printed on posters and on mugs and in the deep corners of memories. And yet inside the ship, the real emotion is that of a checklist performed correctly, ending with the note, engine stop. The cabin does not erupt into celebration. It exhales into procedure. A timer is started. How long before ascent should be contemplated if something smells wrong? Gauges are watched. Temperatures, pressures, the politeness of systems asked to behave in a place that never expected them. Suits stay on. Helmets stay on. The mind is allowed to roam for a minute and then is called back by words. The next steps, the next tasks. When the hatch opens, it is not heavy, it is careful. Latches that were cycled in test buildings click in the same way in silence so deep that the sound seems invented. A man climbs down a ladder that feels like a ladder. The last step is larger than any other. The boot leaves a print, as if dust and foot had made an appointment long ago and are pleased to keep it. Words are spoken for the microphone and the ages, but what matters to the engineer's ear is the breathing that does not gasp and the rhythm that suggests the suit's pumps are content. The first tasks last minutes, not hours. A contingency bag is filled with a handful of rocks and soil scrapes because prudence insists that if all else fails, there should be something to show besides photographs and heartbeats. The flag is a quiet annoyance. A telescoping rod resists its role and bends. A glove finds that grip is power without finesse.
Instruments are unpacked that would bore a child and enthrall a geophysicist. A corner reflector that sends back light forever.
A small seismometer that listens to the moon's deep creaks. A foil to trap solar wind in a way that makes the sun into a souvenir. The steps are choreographed, misunderstood by no one. Clip, unclip, drive a rod into powder that acts like a fluid until it refuses. Balance, measure, back away. Dust sticks to everything. It coats suit legs and the edges of boots and the joints where pleats stretch. It smells metallic inside the suit, a sensation reported across the body by pathways that are not strictly olfactory. The dust's abrasiveness will have its say later. For now, it is a badge. In the module, the housekeeping continues. Filters are changed, recorders are checked, the log is updated. The crew tries to eat a mouthful that tastes of the inside of a plastic bag, chews, swallows, makes a face that will not be seen. Tasks that were practiced in shirt sleeves require more muscle in gloves. Handrails that were in the wrong place in one mock-up are in the right place here, because someone listened to a complaint made late in a long day, months ago, and moved a bracket 2 inches. The body, having owned the day, begins to feel its ask. Shoulders whisper, calves inform. A mind that watched checklists for hours begins to saw the edges off words. Sleep arrives in a place where there is no night. It is summoned by turning off lights and turning down voices and breathing steam against a faceplate that has been defogged so many times it can do it for itself. Dreams, if they come, are about ladder rungs. The ascent is a sentence with a period that must be placed exactly. The button is not magical. It is one of many. Explosive bolts sever structure that did not mind being whole the day before. Wires that carried power and information to legs and panels are left behind to wait for dust to bury them. The ascent engine, a device choked by caution in test after test, lights and the ship leaves in a puff. The guidance remembers how to point its nose and how to plan a path. Rendezvous is not dramatic. It is a repetition performed with a hope that boredom will arrive before surprise. Docking occurs with the same thunk you have heard before, and yet this one carries a special lack of apology. The pieces become one again, and an arch of time closes between undocking and redocking that requires no flourish. There are minutiae in this union that matter more than banners. Latches that fail to catch the first time click correctly on the second. A small pressure equalization over the tunnel is managed by a valve that has seen more use than its designers imagined. A lever that sticks slightly is persuaded by a hand that knows how to be firm without being violent. The samples are moved across, bagged pairs in numbered bundles, each with a story, a rounded pebble dragged by ancient movement, a sharp shard that glinted under a low sun. The instruments left behind begin their own long careers as sentries that speak in slow pulses to receivers far away. The trip home is not a sprint. It is an accounting. Mid-course adjustments remove errors that would move a footprint by miles. The service module engine is asked one last time to behave with the stern benevolence of a parent. The command module is dressed for fire. Upon separation, it becomes temporarily ungainly and then purposeful. The black re-entry streak writes itself across upper air, to an ocean that has been measured and predicted. The parachutes that were not allowed to fail in any test because failure would have ended lineage's bloom, like flowers that have always bloomed but whose seed was placed here by uncountable hours of human worry. The splash is rude and familiar. Recovery is the choreography you have come to love. Swimmers, hooks, lines, hatches, towels. And now, a novelty of caution dressed as science, quarantine. The men are placed inside a travelling glass house where they will be asked how they
Feel 4 times a day and where they will
smile through the strangeness of eating with forks in a room that moves.
on a truck and then on a plane and then sits on a ship.
All because a principle has been embraced. Do not presume safety simply because you are hopeful. The world may prefer to end the story there at the moment of arrival. But you who have been in the rooms where pages were turned and the margins were made bigger know the story continues in a ream of suggestions. Move this switch. Make that lever longer. Change the clip. Roughen the surface here so a glove will grip. Smooth it there so a shoe will not catch. Add a lamp for the next crew to see shadow better under a low sun. Cover a gauge face with a coating that refuses to fog when a breath leaks under a collar in a cough. The post-flight debriefs are full of steno pads and pencil nubs and coffee cups with rings. The voices are calm and analytical, even when describing wonder. Wonder is allowed, then folded back into procedure so that wonder can occur again with less cost and less accident. Parallel lines continue. Another country's heavy booster tries to rise and fails catastrophically, showing that ambition can concentrate risk to a single dreadful moment. Robotic craft sample and survey, dignified by patience more than by drama. Soyuz, whose name means union, enters and exits corridors of grief as it matures into the ship that will carry people to orbit long after the age of flags planted in dust gives way to the age of laboratories. Docking becomes not an event but a commute. Spacesuits become clothing and then uniforms and then tools again. The checklist becomes a culture, and culture becomes the only thing that can fight the human tendency to mistake repetition for immunity. As the first lunar landing fades into the second, which is nearly lost at its beginning to lightning and saved by a switch flicked to an auxiliary mode remembered by a single voice. And the third, which trades a landing for survival after a tank's insides tear, and the ship becomes a lifeboat held together by procedure and breath. You learn that the ordinary has to be protected each time. Later landings will conduct geology with the elegance of a slow dance. Rovers will squeak beneath dust. Suits will whine. Pens will fail and will be tapped against a leg and will work again. The list of things to change will never be empty, because work done in harsh places insists upon humility. You end in a place where the moon looks as it has always looked. The footprints remain until windless time erodes them grain by grain. The instruments sleep, wake, and sleep again, their tongues dry with years, but still reporting when asked. The factories that once bent aluminum into tanks now bend their attention to other projects. The pad towers are disassembled, like giant toys returned to a box. The rooms with boards and maps and clocks host new machines. In the quiet that follows any great effort, people ask whether the effort has been tamed into routine or whether it has already become a memorial. The answer is neither and both. Routine is what you fought to build. Memorial is what time will do to routine. What remains most useful is the habit you have seen everywhere, from the sewing room where a seamstress clipped a thread to the ascent engine test cell where a gauge's needle held firm at the number the book wanted. Do every small thing properly, because the only heroism that lasts is the kind that leaves no space for a miracle to be required. And so the final question settles like dust that refuses to drift. After turning procedures into a road to the moon and back,
How will you, in the next endeavours that call across
distances and decades, whether to stations that orbit, for years, or to new landscapes farther than memory cares to imagine, hold, On to the discipline that made the extraordinary safe enough to attempt, and keep it safe enough to repeat without forgetting that each repetition deserves the same careful breath before you begin.